I would like to introduce the program chair and moderator of this program dealing with Boston Harbor, Bill Gold. And Bill, thank you all for being here this morning. Bill is the project coordinator for the Boston Harbor Storm Surge Working Group. He co-founded the law firm that he works with and is also now of counsel. He's worked at various levels of government, and including the White House, including the U.S. EPA, I assume mostly in Washington. He's not an uninvolved person. He was very involved in co-founding Save the Bay and also MassPIRG, significant accomplishments. And he's currently a adjunct professor at Stony Brook. So with that, I'd like to turn the program over to Bill, and I can't wait to, as all of you are waiting, to hear a lot about what his concern is about Boston Harbor. So Bill, take it away.
Good morning, Dan, and to all of those that have joined this webinar this morning. I am actually addressing you from the Nantucket Lightship, which is safely docked behind a Seagate system in New Bedford, surrounded by the 450 fishing boats that find sanctuary here because of the Seagate system, and have sought protection here from storms for now over 50 years without any failure in reliability or continuity. I want to thank EBC and the Climate Change Committee for giving us this opportunity, and I want to particularly thank Dan Moon. Dan, I think, has gone unrecognized for the incredible leadership and professionalism that he has brought to the New England environmental business community. And Dan, I deeply appreciate that. I also want to thank Jackson Bailey, who behind the scenes makes all this happen and coordinates all of us speakers. It's a little bit like herding cats, so he does a great job at that. But I also want to thank the sponsors that make this possible, and the City of Quincy's sponsorship of the Boston Harbor Regional Storm Surge Working Group. They have really founded this initiative and have supported it now for over 2 years. So what are our expectations and goals today, and what will you learn? There are really 4 takeaway goals of this morning's webinar. The first is there is an existential threat to Boston Harbor coastal communities from sea level rise and storm surge flooding. And this is regional in nature and requires a regional solution. Like many long-term issues that need to be addressed now, this issue is not being addressed now. There is no, number 2, there is no regional plan. There is no regional solution at this time, despite the urgency of it. And we need an urgent action plan now to develop a regional solution. Number 4 is the option of a Boston Harbor regional storm surge coastal resiliency layered defense system merits an immediate, in-depth economic cost-benefit feasibility analysis to determine its cost effectiveness as a critical public policy priority. And frankly, right now, if you look at other cities, and you'll hear from several today, but if you look at other cities, New York is a good example. 8 years after Sandy, there wasn't even a major news piece on the anniversary of Sandy this year. And yet, that is not because, as you'll hear from Professor Bob Yarrow, that New York City has been successful in dealing with it. It has not. So what will you learn this morning? Well, most of you are familiar with the vulnerability of the Boston Harbor coastal communities to flooding from storm surge and sea level rise. Many of you may be less familiar with the Quincy-led initiative to develop the option of a Boston Harbor regional coastal resiliency layered defense system. And perhaps you don't even know what we're referring to when we talk about a layered defense system. You will hear today first about the development of Climate Ready Boston's innovative plans for a local municipal coastal resiliency system that will protect the city of Boston. Next, you will be presented with the concept of a Boston Harbor regional coastal resiliency layered defense. I'll explain what we mean by that term. And the intent of this system would be to integrate a regional storm surge seagate system with the municipal with the municipal coastal resiliency infrastructure systems, such as that of Climate Ready Boston. The following three speakers will focus on the application and evolution of a proven technology in the development of seagate systems in the United States and Europe. And then finally, to emphasize the benefits of a Boston Harbor regional coastal system, we'll hear from Joe Rossi, the founder of the Massachusetts Coastal Coalition, and we'll hear much about just one of several benefits that a regional layered defense system would provide, namely the elimination of all mandatory FEMA and federal required flood insurance, an issue that really raises questions about how we could save billions of dollars with that single benefit. So why don't we transition to our first speaker? And our first speaker is an extraordinary, I guess you'd call him, Dan, an ascending professional. I met Sanjay Seth 3 years ago when he was, or maybe longer than that, when he was a graduate student at Harvard under both the Kennedy School and the urban planning programs. And Sanjay has singularly impressed me. He is really a unique resource for Massachusetts, New England, and the city of Boston, in that he has had experiences both in New York City and now in Massachusetts, and can bring the lessons that he's learned, the experience that he has from both areas. Sanjay is currently the Climate Resiliency Program Manager for the City of Boston. In this role, he leads neighborhood climate resiliency planning, manages the Climate Ready Boston program, and leads other programs and projects that address the impacts of climate change and improve the lives of Boston's residents and visitors. He recently served as project manager for planning and policy, working with an interdisciplinary team on behalf of the City of New York to develop a plan for a multi-billion-dollar investment to protect that city from the impacts of climate change. Sanjay is a dual degree graduate in the Master in Public Administration program at the Harvard University School of Government and the Master in Urban Planning program at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. He also holds a bachelor's in economics, politics, and public policy from Goldsmiths University of London. As you listen to Sanjay, think about the next generation taking over the professional role that many of us have endeavored to play over the last multiple decades. Sanjay is the future, and I am so pleased to introduce him to you now and to welcome his presentation. Sanjay?
Well, that was quite a welcome. Thank you, Bill, for your remarks and for saying that. I'm really glad to be in Boston and doing this work. Before I get started, thank you to Dan and to the lead herder of all of us, Jackson, for creating this opportunity, and Bill for pulling us all together today. So I'll spend the next 15 minutes briefing you a little bit on Climate Ready Boston. I know the folks on this call probably are very familiar with the work that we're doing. But like Bill said, I'm the Climate Resilience Program Manager for the city. I recently started this after working on a Big U project in New York, focusing on the low-lying historic seaport and financial district of Manhattan. And as a reminder, if you have any questions that come up, please put them in the chat, which I know Bill will be monitoring. And we'll get to them later in this session today, not necessarily right after my talk, but we'll have a time to address them. And if there's questions that come up or you'd just like to chat with me directly, feel free to email me at sanjay.sate@boston.gov. Before I get started with today's briefing, I want to thank all of you who are participating or have participated in the city's planning processes. Obviously, the work continues, and we look forward to continuing to engage with all of you. As you know, after the 2016 publication of the city's Climate Ready Boston report, we've been busy undertaking detailed district-level analyses to help develop the city's to-do list when it comes to climate adaptation. Last year, we completed a vision for Moakley Park to close off flood pathways in that area while also improving open space amenities and waterfront access. And this year, in October, we completed the North End and Downtown study and a report on Dorchester. And we've recently launched an additional planning process for to cover the remaining sections of East Boston and Charlestown. Obviously, when these plans are implemented, and the implementation is key, but they will help achieve the vision Mayor Walsh presented in 2018 for a resilient Boston Harbor, which is about achieving a continuous system of protection for Boston's 47-mile shoreline. When implemented, these plans that we've been working on for the past few years will increase access and open space along the water's edge, while also protecting the city from sea level rise and coastal flooding from future storms. One important note I'll add here is, while these are plans for the city is obviously within a region, and it has critical regional infrastructure. So it's important not to think of this only as the city's plan, but as things that protect critical regional infrastructure and help maintain the health of the region. As you all know, the city's layered approach to resilience is focused on buildings, neighborhoods, districts, ordinances, zoning, education, leadership development, and other interventions to achieve a citywide strategy that ensures all Bostonians and all of the regional assets, infrastructure, and institutions within the city that are critical to cities outside of Boston can thrive in the context of a changing climate. So this graphic from our first report back in 2016 outlines some of the different approaches that we need to study and potentially implement to secure Boston's climate future. So I have a habit of starting my presentations with my conclusions, just one, so you don't get bored, and two, so you know where we're heading. So none of this is new to the people on this Zoom, but it's worth emphasizing today that even under certain severe conditions, there are several areas of Boston that can serve as entry points for significantly damaging floods. The risk is only increasing each year, but it's very present today in many of our neighborhoods. So given this urgency, we at the city are committed to exploring all feasible options to reduce climate risk, protect residents, and improve life outcomes for our residents today. But we know it's risky today, and we really need to move urgently. There's a time pressure here. Second, given the complex ownership and activities along the waterfront in Boston, it's clear that there's a role that private owners must play in being a part of the solution. As Climate Ready Boston shows, successfully implementing resilience investments in areas like the Wharf District and downtown require entirely new levels of public-private coordination, as well as new and more robust coordination among private property owners themselves. So we believe it's possible to achieve a world-class resilient waterfront that is safe from severe floods and accessible to the public, but it's complicated and nothing is guaranteed without serious new levels of coordination and collaboration in Boston and across the region. Third, it's urgent. In areas of Boston that are complicated and require extensive public-private coordination, we do have a real but very narrow window to achieve a unified network of protection in the city. We all know in Boston that public-private coordination can take time, and infrastructure projects, especially big ones, do too. So climate change really isn't waiting, and we expect even in the next decade to have significant increases in risk and exposure to severe flooding. So the city is committed to protect all of our neighborhoods from climate change and work with any and all stakeholders to do it. However, we have to do so in an urgent and cost-effective manner given the scale and pace of investments required across the city as a whole. And lastly, this work is really on all of us. While we continue to identify at the city priority projects and secure funding for pilot projects, the scale of funding all of the projects in Climate Ready Boston runs into several billions of dollars, and it crosses public, private, city, state, and federal lines. So it's tricky. And everyone who values an accessible waterfront, a thriving city, and a safe community really does have a stake in ensuring that these plans are not only implementable, but they're actually implemented. And so for many of you on this call, your continued leadership, engagement, scholarship is very critical. And thank you for that. Okay, so if nothing else, those are the main conclusions I want to leave you with. It's risky, it's complicated, it's urgent, and it's on all of us. But now we'll have a chance to really dig into the plans in a little more detail and talk about the solutions coming out of our work. And I trust folks on this call have familiarity with Climate Ready, so I won't spend a lot of time outlining less recent reports like our East Boston and Charlestown, but let's just dig in a little bit. So in 2017, we completed our first district scale analysis in one of our most vulnerable neighborhoods. And so in addition to being a critical gateway community for immigrants and being a neighborhood with environmental justice and gentrification concerns, East Boston has several flood entry points that represent current and near-term risks to the safety of its residents. In particular, as you can see on this map, and I'm sure many of you have seen this before, East Boston has a few major areas of concern. One is the Greenway, which is the central spine of risk, and it's the highest current risk facing East Boston, with 3 separate flood entry points that without action would contribute to severe flooding along that corridor. The second is this alignment along Border Street and Central Square, which in addition to being classified as a designated port area, is also the site of significant flooding and some additional study that we'll talk about later. And overall, in many other areas of this neighborhood, you see a wide range of fringe flooding or flooding that comes over the edge, but is not necessarily a flood entry point deep into the interior. In our 2017 study, we identified critical immediate projects, some of which that we have completed. First, as many of you know, we purchased and regularly test deploying temporary flood barriers to close one of the Greenway flood entry points. And this barrier under Sumner Street actually blocks the current 1% annual chance flood with 1 foot of freeboard. It was a great, in terms of benefit cost, you're protecting thousands of residents and many businesses for something that's a deployable and something we can do today. Additionally, this fall, the BPDA was awarded a $300,000 grant from CZM, the Coastal Zone Management, which will help support flood protection and mitigation measures around Carlton Wharf and Lewis Mall in East Boston, which we identified in this report. And of course, we've seen significant progress at Piers Park and Clipper Ship and figuring out essentially how do we start implementing and knitting together these plans. So East Boston is in progress. And as I mentioned, we're doing a follow-up study and some additional more detailed work. Moving on to Charlestown, which was done at the same time as East Boston. I can draw your attention here to the area near Ryan Playground, the Schrafts Building, and Sullivan Square. This is the main flood entry point that we've defined so far for Charlestown, and it's a current flood entry point, right? It's in the 1% annual chance today. And since this report, we're currently exploring the process of elevating streets in this area, which is a straightforward benefit cost thing we can do to do something now to protect and block off this flood entry point. And we're also exploring, how does this work also connect to other improvements that the neighborhood wants to make or other developments that are currently ongoing or may happen in this area. So, this is stuff that you've seen before, but it's important to remember that there's things happening in every neighborhood of Boston. Transitioning quickly to our South Boston work from 2018. So in South Boston, unlike our prior 2 studies, we actually didn't have these kind of clear flood entry points that were relatively straightforward to close off. So in the South Boston report, in addition to focusing on every aspect of this waterfront, we had particular attention on the 4-point channel, as it's really a critical site for flood entry into South Boston, and also in future years would lead to flooding in the South End, Roxbury, and other areas. You can see the light blue is showing the extent of future flooding that could be a result of not taking action in 4-point channel. So that's another reason why it's critical. And so for the 4-point channel, if you look at the eastern side of that channel, which is in the top of your screen, that is also the site of a 100-acre master plan effort and is a critical flood entry. Since this report, just to share, some of you might know that the city has recently applied for a $10 million pre-disaster FEMA flood mitigation grant to make progress toward addressing this particular flood entry point. Obviously, the full cost and complexity of this is more detailed, but there's work we can do now to help move forward on this 4-point channel and make sure that we're taking action in every neighborhood. This area has been spared significant damage to date, but it's a current risk, and we really do need to move quickly to protect this area and avoid loss of use due to flooding. So I'm moving through these quickly because we have 20 minutes, but again, feel free to put questions in the chat or reach out to me by email. One thing to note, so you can dig into these plans and we really welcome any comments or thoughts you have on them. But for each of these plans, we've developed a series of potential alignments for flood protection throughout the neighborhood. And essentially the main message of this slide is, again, like other neighborhoods in Boston, we need really clear public-private collaboration, and we need additional feasibility studies and engineering studies to really understand what's possible in terms of flood alignments. In some cases, there might be a preference to use city right-of-way if time and urgency drives it and it's really hard to collaborate. And other times, there might be opportunities to pick other alignments. Okay, So we're going through reports that are hundreds of pages in about 30 seconds each, but feel free to jump into them online and send me all of your thoughts. But we're moving on to Dorchester, and I'll spend a little more time with these two reports as they were only released a few months ago. And before digging into Dorchester, it's good to mention that last year, year before publishing this report, we completed a vision plan for Moakley Park that defined a plan, if implemented, that could protect the neighborhood from future flooding and also retain and enhance key active recreational amenities and create equitable access to the waterfront. So this park, which could be compared to the scale of a Brooklyn Bridge Park in New York City, for instance, really gives us the opportunity to demonstrate the added value that climate resilience can bring to residents besides just protecting them from floods, which is very motivating to wonks like us, but maybe less exciting to others. So just south of Moakley Park, which is the green blob on the right, you can see the Bayside Flood Pathway, one of 7 major flood pathways in Dorchester that we'll need to address in a sequenced, phased manner. I'll go over this a little quickly, but our report recommends integrating flood protection along with the Bay City development project near Carson Beach, tying into the work around Moakley, and then raising the harbor walk around Harbor Point and tying into high ground at UMass. So there's obviously the goal is a continuous line of protection, and I'll just go over quickly how we would get there in Dorchester. Similarly, at Morrissey Boulevard North, our report really defines a couple options. One of them could be as simple as just raising Morrissey, and another option would be developing a berm along the edge of Morrissey, a berm being a pile of dirt that blocks water. Doing that along Morrissey instead, and then raising areas, including McConnell Park, to finalize this section of protection for Dorchester. And the main benefit there is you're protecting access to the waterfront, you're protecting existing community assets, and you're coming up with solutions that are very adaptable and cost effective, and we can put them together quickly.
Sanjay, you have 5 minutes left.
Great, thank you. I should be good. So in this report, we look at building out additional berms along Morrissey Boulevard South, close to the flood pathway, ensuring access to Tenian Beach. I think I'm going to flip through these ones pretty quickly, given we have 5 minutes. And essentially, the main thing here is that it is possible to have a clear alignment in this section. And some of the near-term work we can do is actually looking at deployable flood barriers at the Conley Street underpass to address current risks. And in the long term, thinking about additional berms and road raising. This is an interesting neighborhood. This is the Port Norfolk neighborhood of Dorchester. And in our report, we propose raising the roads and park elements to protect the existing neighborhood. And then also to the discussion of a layered approach, really thinking about additional building level adaptations for individual homes that are impacted. So not only thinking about protecting with raised elements, but also looking at the individual homes and doing a similar thing in the long term there too. And lastly, in our Dorchester report, we determined that maintaining the existing wetlands in this area can actually maintain flood protection while giving us other improvements and retaining existing ecosystem services. So, we can use our existing features, our existing wetlands to protect us and provide some benefits there as well, while conserving intact wetlands. Lastly, I'm going to go into the North End and Downtown report. The long story short here is that there's flooding, and without action, there's going to be a lot more. The dark blue here in this map shows you current flooding, which if you look at the Long Wharf area, is significant today. The medium blue shows you flooding associated with 9 inches of sea level rise that we expect in the next decade, and the light blue is 40 inches of sea level rise expected in the next 50 years. And you can notice significant connections between the flood entry points. So there's no silver bullet here. There's no single solution. You do need to deal with the whole district. Our work really looks at a district-wide solution and looks at 4 different options to implement this. There's spines, which are raised roadways or linear elements. Open spaces are what they are. Raising the harbor walk, and looking at offshore elements like filled lands or ecological systems and breakwaters. So some mix of this is going to be necessary, and it's not going to be easy, but it's going to be doable. And the city will help facilitate this negotiation process, working with all the folks who own land along the waterfront to really see if we can get to the preferred option, which is the one on the left, which utilizes all of these strategies to make sure that we can maintain access and have everyone protected behind a line of protection. The main challenge there is obviously cost, complexity of collaboration, the length of the actual perimeter of protection that's required to cover every wharf, and the complexity of building on existing bulkheads. The one on the right is the fallback option, which is obviously not preferred, but would use only city-owned lands, and this would allow us to more quickly establish a continuous line of protection. If you're interested, you can look at Langone Park in Popolo for one of the city's first implementations of a park with climate resilient design. And we've launched a stakeholder group for Long Wharf to look at private property owners and what they're doing. And so while we won't be able to realize this vision tomorrow, the projects presented in these plans are feasible and they're cost effective and they do protect residents. And so, you know, these projects will help deliver on Mayor Walsh's vision of a unified line of protection across the entire harbor that not only protects residents from climate change, which is the goal of many of the people on this call, but also equitably improves their access to the waterfront and ensures these investments add value to the residents and visitors and their everyday lives on sunny and stormy days. Quickly, what's next for Climate Ready Boston? We have a bunch of things coming up. One of them is a citywide heat resiliency strategy. So we're targeting environmental justice communities and communities with a specific race lens on how Boston and people's experience of Boston has been so far. And we're going to be looking at those communities, coming up with some strategies and proposing how to move forward in the near term on heat. We're working with the BPDA on some East Boston resilient design options, thinking about how do we move forward on some of the things that we've identified in our prior plans from 2017. And I mentioned our phase 2 planning. And then finally, something I'm really excited about is how do we bake flood resilience into our zoning? This is a best practice, a global best practice, and Boston's kind of at the front of this, along with a few other cities. How do we really do this in a way that makes sense, is clear to all parties, and actually achieves the goal of a more resilient Boston? I think with that, I've hit my time. And so thank you all for, again, for creating this opportunity to connect with you and learn more about some of the solutions that all of you on this call are going to be discussing today. I really look forward to hearing from you. And again, please feel free to reach out anytime at sanjay.sate@boston.gov. Thank you very much.
First, Sanjay, excellent presentation. I think all of you that are participating understand now what I was saying about Sanjay and his ascendance as a professional leader in Boston and New England. Sanjay, I think you should start training for the marathon since you've just covered 45 miles of coastline in 20 minutes. You did very well there. I'm a big fan of Climate Ready Boston. I really think it's been a national leader early on and continues to be a leader. And I'm very, very pleased that Sanjay is now managing the coastal resiliency goals of Climate Ready Boston. It's my privilege today to talk about the option of a Boston Harbor Regional Coastal Resiliency Layered Defense System. Let me just see, we joining that, we on here? Let me just see. I guess I have to do one more thing. There, I think everybody can see the map of Boston Harbor here. Starting with this first page, just to take a moment here to look at Boston Harbor as a geographic area. Boston Harbor is distinctive. It has 175 miles of coastline, and it's protected by two large barrier beaches. One to the south is Hull, and that protects much of the South Shore area from the velocity of waves and wave action and reduces the fetch of those waves. Then you have a series of Boston Harbor islands that also reduce the force and fetch of storm surge waves. And then to the north, you have Deer Island and the rest of Winthrop that act as a barrier to the north. this is a very distinctive harbor and provides us with an option for a regional solution of a Seagate system that would run from the tip of Hull to the tip of Winthrop and protect over 175 miles of Boston Harbor coastline. Not all communities have this option. Many are just exposed directly to bodies of water such as Massachusetts Bay. So if we, oops, I'm sorry. If we look at Boston Harbor though, from the perspective of cities and towns, there are 15 cities and towns that flood through Boston Harbor. Boston, Braintree, Cambridge, Chelsea, Everett, Hingham, Hull, Malden, Medford, Milton, Quincy, Revere, Somerville, and Weymouth. I think Saugus should be on there as well. But these are all political subdivisions, and each of them under the state programs has developed vulnerability assessments for their communities and have developed plans and are implementing those plans to protect their shorelines on a local municipal basis. This is all good and is all supported by the Storm Surge Working Group. We believe that these plans, just like the Climate Ready Boston plans, are all plans that should proceed expeditiously, but we believe they should be plans that are integrated community to community on a regional basis for shoreline protection, and that the added benefit of a regional plan should also be used to coordinate with the local plans. Storm surge and sea level rise are often like one word: storm surge, sea level rise. And those four are the forces, along with subsidence, that exacerbate coastal flooding in Boston Harbor, but really they're two separate phenomena. And this is important to think about. Many years ago, when I filed the lawsuit to clean up Boston Harbor that resulted in the creation of the MWRA, I was looking at two solutions that were combined to address the treatment of sewage in Boston Harbor. One of them was to address storm surge, was to address sewage disposal, and one was to address storm water disposal. And they were combined into a single combined system with all these CSOs. They thought one solution could address both phenomena. And as many of you know, as engineers that have dealt with the cleanup of Boston Harbor, that one solution fits all just simply didn't work. And turned out to be a great problem. In this case as well, we believe that these are two separate phenomenon, and they have to be addressed with two separate approaches. Sea level rise is gradual, at least in the short term and midterm. In the longer term, there's a great deal of discrepancy as in projections as to how fast and how high the sea level will rise. But there is a sense that in all quarters that this is gradual. And in the near term, we're dealing with nuisance flooding and with the minimal damage caused by nuisance flooding. Storm surge is much different. Storm surge is caused by extreme weather events such as tropical cyclones and nor'easters. And these storms are more frequent and getting stronger and more damaging due to climate change. 2020 was a record year, and I'm sure most of you have followed this, but there were 30 named Atlantic storms, and 12 of those hit the United States. They hit mostly in the Gulf, so it didn't seem like a record season up here in the Northeast, but it was a tragically record season for those 12, the areas in which those 12 storms hit, particularly in the Gulf Coast. But we have to recognize that we've been building along the coast now, and that 40% of the population of the United States lives along the coast. So if you look at these Atlantic storms, 15 of the most destructive US storms in history have occurred since 2004. Since 2004, just in less than 20 years. And this storm surge devastation has wiped out residences and commercial buildings and a great deal of public infrastructure in New York City. Sandy, which wasn't even a hurricane by the time it hit New York City, devastated the subway system, the airports, the port facilities, as well as inland with the residential commercial buildings. And so we have a sense of urgency here. Storm surge is a more devastating threat than sea level rise, and yet we are focusing more on sea level rise than a regional solution for storm surge. So in 2018, I mean, I'm a Bostonian, and I know that, by the way, there'll be a quiz here. One of our speakers is from Indiana, one is from Boston, one is from Queens, and one is from Texas. And we'll have a quiz afterwards for you to determine which is which, but I think it'll be quite obvious, actually. In 2013, I held the first conference, interstate national conference on sea level rise and storm surge and aging infrastructure at the Kennedy School. And at that time, the general attitude from people from Boston was, well, that's for the rest of the country. Boston is different. And as we all know from Boston, the rules of gravity or hydrodynamics don't apply to Boston, but they really do. And in 2016, with the king tides, 2018 with the nor'easters, we received a wake-up call. The entire Boston Harbor region was flooded. Public safety and security in these communities was dramatically witnessed by rescues from Winthrop to Hull, in which people's lives were placed in danger. Not only the people who were in areas that were flooded, but the first responders that bravely went out in the storm to save them. And our economy was impacted. Boston is the engine for the whole Northeast, for the economic engine for all of New England. And this whole metro area was so impacted that we not only lost buildings and structures and had that kind of damage and public infrastructure, but there was a great deal of business disruption that hurt the economy for some time to come, particularly in low income and poor areas. It even impacted the marine ecology of Boston Harbor. For those of you familiar with Belle Island Marsh, you'll know how devastated that natural.
Very special pot at some.
And it really challenged social justice goals and values. So what do we mean by a layered defense? Simply, a layered defense is a defense system where local land-based coastal infrastructure protects against sea level rise, and regional structures, a regional seagate system, would protect against storm surge. Land-based coastal resiliency has limitations. Flood walls, particularly when they're meant to address storm surge and sea level rise, can separate the public from the water. They can be 15 feet high and separate the water of Boston Harbor, which we've tried to connect with communities, in a significant way. They leave water-dependent uses unprotected. If you can't build that perimeter right along every wharf and every terminal and the airport and all those facilities, the piers, docks, tank farms, and air and land transportation facilities, then they're on the wrong side of the system, and they're going to get flooded repeatedly. You risk catastrophic overtopping. The water going over a regional seagate system goes into the harbor. One that goes over a land-based system goes into the community. And they leave communities outside Boston with insufficient benefit to justify cost if they're done only in Boston. And again, they leave poor and low-income families particularly vulnerable. The advantages of a layered defense system are the opposite of that. They don't leave communities outside Boston with insufficient benefit to justify costs. They provide uniform storm surge protection, and they provide comprehensive protection for all public and private coastal infrastructure. And they ensure regional public safety and economic protection. Study of a layered defense option is good public policy. It's good for the economy, it's good for public safety. The option of a Boston Harbor regional coastal resiliency system merits study. It has not been studied. There was a UMass study that came out a couple of years ago, but it says right in the study that one, it's a preliminary study, and two, it doesn't address layered defense or hybrid systems. I'm quoting from the study when I said one option not explored It's a hybrid solution where a barrier is only used to manage low frequency intense events with a limited number of closures during a decade, and shore-based alternatives manage all events while providing protection to events managed by a barrier system. That is what we're So in doing this study, we have to look at a number of cost factors. That means looking at all kinds of different designs, design life options, alternative construction methods, construction timeframe, the possible multiple beneficial uses, particularly looking at discount rates that are applied and finance options. The economic benefits of the Boston Harbor Regional Layered Defense System are multiple. They protect public infrastructure. You don't have to raise roads and train tracks and all that. Protection of residential and commercial structures, reduction in flood-related building code costs, preservation of private asset value and public tax base, improved municipal corporate bond ratings, increased coastal development due to new flood-related zoning restrictions, reduction in business disruption costs, reduction in insurance costs, which you'll hear more about, with the elimination of mandatory FEMA and other federal insurance requirements, reduction in the cost of perimeter land-based coastal resiliency infrastructure. You do not have to protect every single mile of the 175 miles of coastline with a large system that protects against sea level rise and storm surge. And also you avoid what is a significant problem with land-based structures that are of any height. You can reduce stormwater pumping and retention facility costs because those walls around on the perimeter are going to be bathtubs to collect stormwater in the event of heavy rain situations. So we have proposed multiple location options. Here are 4 of them to look at. Seagate systems have this idea in Boston that they're not proven technology. Well, they are proven technology. They're proven technology throughout the US and Europe, as you'll hear. But even closer to home, the systems in New Bedford, which is set forth on this screen, as well as in Providence and Stamford, Connecticut, have protected these areas and provided these X zones where there's no mandatory federal flood insurance required for over 50 years. This is proven technology. So there's an urgent need to act. We have to address storm surge, not just sea level rise. And to obtain federal funding, we have to have a shovel-worthy regional coastal layered defense plan. We need a plan so that when this infrastructure bill comes through, which will be a once in a lifetime multi-trillion-dollar bill in the next Congress, we need to know what we're going to do with that money and have a plan to develop it. As you'll hear, that's so critical. And it's been a part of New York and Galveston and all of the developments in Europe. So in conclusion here, we have an option here that offers significant potential advantages. One of the reasons for this is that if you have a regional Seagate system that stretches from Hull to Winthrop and you close it at the last low tide before a storm hits, first, you don't have these false alerts where people are setting up and closing down streets and everything, putting in deployables to try to knit together the shoreline defenses. You don't have that happening 3 days in advance and then have no storm. You do it at the last low tide before a storm hits. And what does that mean? That means you have a water prism of 175 miles around that's 10 feet deep. You have a swimming pool that's not filled, that's 175 miles around, 10 feet deep. Not only does that accept the riverine flows from the Charles and the Mystic and the Neponset and the back and Four Rivers and the Weir River, but it creates a huge facility so that in 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years from now, excuse me, if the regional system gets overtopped, it's going to go into this pool. It's not going to be flooding anything. So that means you can lower the costs and the design features of that system. But as a matter of sound public policy, the Commonwealth, the state, must proceed immediately with an in-depth cost-benefit analysis to determine the economic viability of this option. It's just such an urgent priority that we need now to find the leadership to go forward with this. It takes about 10 to 15 years to complete this kind of system. It took many more years to complete the Boston Harbor cleanup, for example, or the Big Dig. But in doing that, it built the basic infrastructure for the city of Boston. This infrastructure, if it's put into effect, would protect the city of Boston and 14 other cities and towns that flood through Boston Harbor for 100 years or more. After that, maybe all bets are off. But I think Boston and the other communities deserve that 100 years. Thank you very much. Now, let me introduce the next speaker. Next speaker is a good friend and someone I've known for many, many years, going back to the 1970s. Bob Yarrow worked in the early Dukakis administration as an assistant to the Secretary of Environmental Affairs. And he played a very important role in flooding early on. Some of you, maybe very few of you on this call, remember the blizzard of '78. But that was a wake-up call of its own. And after that call, it was Bob Yarrow that implemented a statewide plan to address the public safety and economic impacts of an extreme flooding event. And Bob hasn't stopped since then. Bob, for 25 years, was president of an organization called the Regional Plan Association, a very unique and very distinguished organization that has received worldwide acclaim as well as national acclaim. This is an association that represents the states of Connecticut, New Jersey, and New York. And in this role, Bob planned the major infrastructure improvements, the interstate improvements, as well as improvements within the city of New York that have guided that city's growth and will for the next 50 to 100 years. Major accomplishments. And Bob recently has taken on the role of leading with Professor Malcolm Bowman from the Stony Brook School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences, a program to protect New York City. And this started quite a few years ago. And it's my pleasure to have the opportunity for those who are participating in this webinar today to take a hard look at what another city has gone through and where it is today. So please meet my friend and my hero, Bob Yarrow.
Hey, Bill. Thanks for that kind introduction. Again, I have sort of deep associations with the city of Boston and Boston Harbor. Mike Dukakis hired me in his first term in the 1970s, among other things, to develop what is now the Boston Harbor Islands National Park. And we went on a spree buying islands and improving islands and so forth. Did the early improvements on Long Wharf and the ferry terminals in Hingham and Rose Wharf and downtown Boston. So this is a place that is near and dear to my heart. Again, thanks for the opportunity to speak today. I'll be reporting on a work in progress in New York. We've made considerable progress in outlining and developing plans for the kind of layered defense that Bill is describing for Boston. We had a surprise earlier this year when President Trump pulled the plug on an Army Corps of Engineers feasibility study in the middle of the study and told us that we, instead of building a layered defense system, should buy a lot of mops and buckets to deal with storm surges and sea level rise. Not terribly helpful. But let me go to my slides, okay? And I'll tell you that so Sandy really was the wake-up call for New York, in much the way that the four Easters a couple of years ago, I think, were a wake-up call for the city of Boston and for the cities fronting on Boston Harbor. One of the big lessons I've learned in thinking about this, I lived in Stamford, Connecticut for many years, which has a hurricane barrier, is that these things, they take a long time to develop political consensus around. And usually it takes 2 or 3 devastating storms before people decide that they need to do something. Bill McDonough's famous quip that, we as a species, we think we're really smart, but if you think about it, it took us 10,000 years to put wheels on luggage. It's kind of where we are. We don't respond to dangers very effectively as a species. Let's go to the slides, and I'll just go through these fairly quickly. we've had the biggest hurricane season in history. We've had dozens of storms now that have, and many of them hitting the mainland of the United States. And National Academy of Sciences and others, New York Academy of Sciences, both forecasting that we can expect more severe and more frequent major storms and storm surges in the years to come. I like to tell my friends in Boston that if Sandy had taken a left hook 100 miles farther north, Boston would have been devastated. We would have been spared, but we got the message more or less. Next, please. We had $75 billion in physical damage, much longer term damage to infrastructure, disruption of business, and so forth, and more than 100 people killed in the metropolitan area around New York by Sandy. Next, please. Unfortunately, the immediate response was similar to the immediate response in Boston, which was every man for himself. Like Boston Harbor, we have dozens of communities fronting on New York Harbor and the Lower Bay, and each community kind of went out on its own and started developing its own local protection strategy, essentially perimeter barriers, seawalls and dikes and levees and so forth. Next, please. City of New York proposed building literally dozens of onshore barriers or soft solutions, created wetlands and so forth that left much of the region with little or no protection. Next. Mayor Bloomberg directed his staff immediately after Sandy to come up with solutions that could be implemented by the city on its own without having to collaborate with the state of New York or the state of New Jersey. And he also, was very skeptical of the offshore Seagate, concept. And he, told me right after Sandy, he said, "Look, Bob, King Canute couldn't keep out the tides, and neither can I." And I reminded him that King Canute didn't fly to Bermuda every weekend to go play golf. And some new technology since then. He glowered at me, and but that was the direction that he gave to his staff, stuff that they could do, the city could do on its own, without having to collaborate with the Army Corps or the state of New York or state of New Jersey. And again, most of these projects are now, none of them have been built. Nothing's operational after 8 years, and none of them are fully funded at this point. Next, please. A detailed map that if anybody's interested, I can show you the dozens of different recommended actions to protect just the 5 boroughs of New York City. And then you see that the gray area to the west and the east are the terra incognita. They're like the pre-Columbian maps of the world, that we know that there's intelligent life in New Jersey and on Long Island, but we don't know much about it. We're certainly not going to do much about it. Next, please. These projects leave large areas of the region and our most vulnerable infrastructure. These are the Amtrak tunnels under the Hudson on the right and LaGuardia Airport on the left, that are going to be subject to continued threats from storm surges and sea level rise. Next, please. We've been looking at the communities affected by this, and an inordinate share of the impacts have been on low-income communities. Robert Moses and others loaded up places like the Rockaways in South Queens that flood frequently with public housing, and nursing homes and that sort of thing are highly concentrated in these areas. So it's an inordinate impact on the most vulnerable populations. Next, please. We know now that projects that were supposed to be fast, relatively low cost and effective are turning out to be take a lot of time to design and build, cost a lot of money, more than the city of New York or the other municipalities have on their own, and in many cases are quite questionable effectiveness. Next, please. Meanwhile, we've been looking at what we'll hear more about this from Charles later on, that the rest of the world is moving ahead, and from Bill in Houston and Galveston, the rest of the world is moving ahead with regional Seagate or storm surge barrier systems to provide more cost-effective protection for entire metropolitan areas. I remember, very soon after Sandy, we started consulting with Dutch engineers about alternatives for New York. And the first thing that they said was you have to do is to shorten the coastline. You can't protect hundreds of miles of coastline with onshore barriers in a cost-effective way. You need to find a way to create a shorter barrier system that can provide protection against storm surges. Next, please. So with the leadership of Malcolm Bowman, a very distinguished professor at the State University of New York at Stony Brook, we've developed a proposal for a network of sea gates. These would be movable gate systems like the Thames Barrier, with large gates for the Ambrose Channel, Shipping Channel, and so forth. A 5-mile-long barrier stretching from the Rockaways to Sandy Hook at the south end of the Lower Bay, and then a 1-mile-long barrier across the East River in the Bronx and Queens. Next, please. The regional system would complement local defenses that would be lower onshore barriers in flood-prone areas designed to deal with sea level rise and less frequent, less severe storms and so forth. The major storms, you'd see the gates closing initially, probably once every few years. In the future, with increased severity of storms, probably more frequent. It'd be like the Stamford barrier, which used to close once every 3 or 4 years and now closes 3 or 4 times a year. Next, please. These gates, as Bill mentioned, use off-the-shelf technology. This is a proven technology. This is the Stamford. This is the gate into the Inner Harbor, and Stamford on the left, the aerial view of the New Bedford barrier on the right, where Bill's lightship is today. These are now 50-year-old barrier systems that have never failed to protect these cities from flooding, while nearby areas have had devastating floods repeatedly. Next. So we've gotten all kinds of pushback from advocates for resiliency, and resiliency for many people, unfortunately, is defined as we living with water, which is fine, but for some people, it's I just to summarize it as run for your lives. There's nothing we can do to mitigate the impacts of storm surges and sea level rise, which I think is just dead wrong. There seems, I describe it as kind of a screw loose in our society of people who just don't believe that we can intervene with Mother Nature or manage changes that are coming in climate. So at any rate, so we got to be more resilient, but we've got to be smarter about how we do it. Next, please. Some of the detractors of the Seagate system in New York have argued that it would cause environmental damage, but in fact, the analysis that Professor Bowman and others have done indicates that we can actually improve water quality by managing the gate system to prevent really dirty water from flowing up the East River into Western Long Island Sound. So we can get a net improvement in water quality and fisheries and so forth at the same time that we would not impinge on these resources elsewhere in the region. Next, please. Others have argued that they cost too much, but in fact, when you add up the cost of the various onshore barrier systems that have been proposed for the New York metropolitan area, they exceed the cost of an offshore barrier system and the kind of layered defense that Bill and I are both talking about. Next, please. Another argument: take too long to build. When we decide to do these things, we actually can do them relatively quickly. It was less than 5 years to build the New Orleans new barrier system. Your tax dollars at work. Again, we had a devastating storm that was the catalyst for some political leadership in that case, and it's the kind of leadership that's going to be needed in Boston and New York to advance similar initiatives. Next, please. This argument that these systems are not safe or not proven technology. In the reality, these things have been built, all over the world and have a almost flawless history of succeeding in protecting these places. Next. One of the arguments against the system is that, or the fear is that it would raise water levels when the gates are closed. The analysis that's been done by Stony Brook and others indicates that we would have an increase in water levels outside the barrier in Long Island Sound of a few inches and less than that in the ocean. Very little impact on water levels outside of the barriers. Next, please. One of the arguments is that being made by environmentalists is, well, all we need to do is to restore the wetlands and natural systems, and that would provide protection against storm surges. But when we've had these conversations with advocates and say, well, exactly how many of the 14 feet of storm surges that Sandy caused in New York would a network of oyster beds and salt marshes have prevented? And the answer from the advocates for these things was, well, none of it. I mean, they're really good at if you've got miles and miles and miles of these things, as New Orleans and some of the Louisiana cities have, why, yes, indeed, you can soak up a tremendous amount of water. But when you've got 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 feet, as you do in most of New York or Boston Harbor, very little or almost none of the storm surges could be mitigated. Next, please. We've heard that large areas of our region would be left out protected, but in fact, the barrier system, the Seagate system that we are proposing, would protect 90% or more of the population of and the critical infrastructure in the core of the New York metropolitan region. Next, please. I hear this argument that allowing flooding to occur builds social capital, and this is an image of the National Guardsmen and the Rockaways after Sandy, and I just can't think of a worse way to build social capital and destroy people's lives and livelihoods, so I think our argument is the best way to build social capital is to keep the water out and the lights on, and to protect low and moderate income communities from these threats and to keep them safe. Next, please. Again, the argument that they won't be reliable, and systems in London and Providence and all over the world have been found to be reliable over 50 or more years. Next, please. And finally, what about sea level rise? And this is a big question for all of us. And we'll hear more about this from Bill, I think, and from Charles, that even with the 6 feet and projected sea level rise by the end of the century, we believe that the surge barrier that we're proposing will give us 100 years or more to adapt our region to climate change. And we're going to have to reinvent our civilization if the West Antarctic ice shelf decides to go free or break up. We got other problems, but we need to have some time to plan to reinvent our cities and our civilization around the more even more destructive change that may be coming if we are not successful in managing global climate change. Next, please. What's missing in New York, and what I suspect may be missing in Boston, is the political will and the leadership to build the kind of layered defense system that New York and Boston and other cities all up and down the East Coast and the Gulf Coast of the United States need. The very clear lesson from the experience in London and Providence and New Bedford and Stamford and other cities that have these is that you need a series of catastrophic storms killing a lot of people and doing tens of billions or hundreds of billions in property damage before we get that leadership. And do we really? I hope that we don't need to wait. The colonel in charge of the Army Corps office in New York, after President Trump shut down the feasibility study for the layered defense system that we're talking about for New York, he off the record said, well, maybe what we need to do is have another disaster storm to get people to focus on this issue. Next, please. Heck of a way to run a civilization. So other cities are moving ahead. The Army Corps was, well on its way to completing a feasibility study of a harbor-wide alternatives. One of them was the offshore Seagate system. They really didn't get into the layered defense alternatives. They really didn't have the resources to adequately assess the costs and benefits of the surge barrier system. And then last spring, just before the pandemic hit. Next slide, please. Okay, last slide. There we go. This is our message from Donald Trump back in January. That a Time story came out. Of course, it's the newspaper of record reporting that the offshore barrier system would cost 100 billion or more, Donald Trump doubled that to 200 billion. The Corps at that point was estimating 60 billion. And we believe that in fact, the real cost, and it was 60 billion because they had a 25-year build out and a very, very expensive approach. It was a 46-foot high barrier where a 30-foot high barrier would do the job. At any rate, Donald Trump put out a tweet that said shut the project down, and the next day OMB shut the project down. So we are looking at whether we can get enough mops and buckets to anticipate the next storm. I think the lesson learned here is that I hope that Boston doesn't need to have one or more additional catastrophic storms to focus on this issue. I think the kind of layered defense that Bill is talking about, and that could incorporate many of the improvements that Sanjay laid out earlier this morning, I think that's where Boston needs to go to protect all of the 15 cities and towns that front on Boston Harbor. So the question is, can we develop the political leadership in the Commonwealth to advance a project like that? As Bill said, we'll see what happens with the Georgia Senate races. Will Joe Biden be able to advance the multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure and climate initiative that he's proposed? If he does, other U.S. cities are going to be moving ahead with implementation programs to protect themselves from these twin threats of sea level rise and storm surges. And the question is whether Boston's going to be ready to move ahead with that, or will you once again have your tax dollars being spent in other places to protect other places? Thanks very much. Appreciate the opportunity to speak today and look forward to the discussion later this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. As you could tell from Bob's presentation, Bob is a legend, and he has been dealing with complex, difficult public policy issues for decades now. But what he's pointed out is something very simple. It's a very simple concept. It was brought up, it was implemented, by the Dutch hundreds of years ago, and that is the concept of shortening the coastline. Should we build around 550 miles of coastline in New Jersey and New York to protect the Port of New York? Or should we have a 5-mile barrier and a 1-mile barrier? Should we build a barrier around a land-based barrier for storm surge and sea level rise around 175 miles of coastline in Boston Harbor? Or should we build a 4 to 5 mile system to protect that entire area? Well, since this concept developed in Europe, we've been able to bring today one of the true experts on this, true global experts on this technology, on infrastructure engineering. Charles Schelp is Jacobs' global technology leader for flood infrastructure engineering and has over 30 years of broad experience in the delivery of flood risk management, river engineering, and other infrastructure projects in the UK, the US, and elsewhere across the world. He has 15 years experience in the delivery of storm surge barrier systems from concept through design and construction to operation and maintenance. He is currently Jacobs' technical lead on the Boston, Bridgewater, and Lawcraft barrier schemes in the UK, and is the Jacobs Senior Technical Consultant for the Thames Estuary Asset Management 2100 program, which includes the Thames Barrier, as well as other associated tidal barriers, sea gates within the Thames Estuary. Charles is an active participant also in the International Storm Surge Barrier Network called iStorm. We'll be featuring the iStorm in a spring, late winter conference. iStorm is an association of all of the operators of all of the Seagate systems throughout the world. And they share candidly their experience on design, operation, and maintenance, and have created a dynamic, evolving technology along with all the engineering companies such as Jacobs who work with them to provide state-of-the-art developments now in Seagate systems and layered defense systems. He's now involved has been involved in workshops as well concerning the storm surge barrier concepts for both New York and Galveston. I met Charles several years ago when I was working with Bob Yarrow and Malcolm Bowman on the New York project. And we had a gentleman which we called the Lion of New York City, Dick Ravitch, who was a major influential dean of the political scene in New York. And he was a little skeptical about our proposal for a regional solution. So he wanted to see the Thames barrier. So it was Charles that conducted a very personal tour of the barrier and the related infrastructure for Dick. And Dick went from skeptic to cheerleader, meeting that night with 3 members of his friends, 3 members of the House of Lords, who also convinced him that this was the way to go, the layered defense concept of a shortened coastline. So it's with great pleasure that I have this opportunity to introduce all of you to one of the technology leaders in the world in this field, Charles Schell.
Thanks. So thanks for those words, Bob. I've got quite a large task in 20 minutes to go through all the European Seagate systems. And they go from large to small, and I sort of, in a way, I'll rattle through. But there are some lessons learned, and Bob Yarrow sort of picked them up, you know, sort of picking up on things in terms of resilience and sort of a technology that works, but it works as a system, and that's the key. It's not the gates on their own. It's an overall and overarching system. So just picking out sort of key features. So the UK and the Netherlands obviously have a fair number of barriers, including some of the famous ones that many of you may have seen. There's Russia, Italy with the Mosa for Venice, and Germany and Belgium. And some of these are sort of there, they're operating, they've been working for many years. And I'm just going to highlight as well some of the projects that have been coming through that are sort of almost starting detail design or in construction. So it shows how things are developing over time, that this is a technology that's currently applied and continues to be applied throughout Europe. So in terms of the UK, the map on the left shows you various little red dots, obviously primarily sort of focused on the East Coast, which picks up sort of some of the big storm surges in the North Sea and has the greatest effect. And obviously in the 1953 flood that created huge devastation, both in the UK and in Europe and the Netherlands in particular. And one of the things I just wanted to pick up was the UK has its own Boston barrier. So there is a Boston barrier or Seagate being constructed at this very moment in time. It's got another 2 years to go, but the main barrier, when you see the photos, is actually complete. And I was on a call this morning for handover tomorrow. So Boston has got its barrier, but it's in the wrong place, I fear, certainly for you folk in Massachusetts. And that's Boston on the bottom right-hand corner, flooding. So I was part of a study. We were busy studying barrier options when the December 2013 floods came. So Hull next door had its barrier and it was protected. London with its Thames barrier was protected, but Boston, everybody was talking about it and the funding was dubious. And I wasn't there, there was no political will, but it got flooded. So I was doing and working with teams actually looking at where the flooding was going to be and advising emergency services and the like. So it just tells you that these things work, okay? And as I go through the various barriers, I'll highlight big barriers being built and being used very quickly thereafter. If you look at Katrina and New Orleans, that system worked pretty damn quickly after it was installed to protect further flooding there. So I'm going to talk about the Thames barrier system, and I'll pick up some of the gates and some of the dimensions and the like. But it's important to note with the Thames barrier system, that's the whole Thames estuary, North Sea off to your right, that the Thames barrier, if you can see my cursor, is located right up here at Greenwich. And there's a whole estuary system, and all the way along, you've got a whole series of other sea gates, or barriers as you want to say, shutting off the creeks and the other smaller rivers and tidal estuary rivers that sort of join into the main Thames estuary. So don't think that by trying to stop off at one place that you prevent all these sea gates everywhere else. New York is a classic where if you retreat, suddenly you pick up a whole host of these other gates, and they all have to be operated and they all have to be maintained. And a key thing to note in this is at this present moment in time, on the back of the Thames Estuary Plan, so there's actually the Environment Agency and the UK government has invested in a strategy for the Thames Estuary 2100, so looking up to 2100, and part of that is actually looking at a new Thames barrier. So I'm sort of just starting studies and sort of looking at location of a Thames barrier is actually further down, where it says North Fleet and Tilbury, looking at a new barrier, because you've got to start planning now. You need to start thinking now and how you react to any wall raising and everything else that's going on in the estuary. Where would your future barrier be? Because the Thames barrier, they reckon, has got sufficient life until 2070. And it can manage the sea level rise up until then. There's another issue that the older it gets, the more maintenance you need to put in to keep it reliable as a system. And you'll find that the time span in which you can have a maintenance being undertaken on the barrier is diminished and squeezed until you have no time, because you've got surge events come in almost throughout the year. Now at the moment, and in sort of Holland, there's a storm surge season, but in the future, there won't be a season. It'll be all year round. So it's an important part to note and think through these systems in the long term. So the Thames barrier, obviously a very iconic barrier. The photos there are showing it's essentially a barrier closed. This is a test closure that's ongoing, and it's open, but you can see the big city behind in which it's protecting, and the many billions of and trillions of sort of benefits or sort of flood damage avoided. It was finished in the 1980s, 1982 or circa. It covers 1,705 feet wide, and in today's money would be costing, they estimated, about 2.4, maybe 3 billion, but of that sort of order of dollars. It's got a series of gates. It's got 4 main navigable gates, which are 61 meters or 200 feet wide, and then a series of other sector gates and sort of 4 falling radials, which sit at either side. But important to note, since its construction, it's had 193 closures. So 193 closures over the up to the sort of current day, which was far more than was ever envisaged at the time of its construction. And the other interesting thing, picking up on Bill's comment earlier on, is that 87 of those, and a lot of those are coming now with sort of more intense rainfall, is that the barrier, as you can see there, is actually being operated to withhold the tide and create the bathtub behind for the Thames to actually, the fluvial Thames, to actually keep on pouring in and not be tide locked, which is causing substantial flooding upstream at the top end of the Thames, of the tidal Thames reach, which is the Teddington sort of weir and locks. So it's been used in 2 ways, and the sort of the rising sector gate format actually allows that to happen, in that it's a dual function now. And that's in a way some of the discussion that you were raising, Bill, as a system, because things can actually discharge through gravity and not have to be pumped. That gravity system can continue for longer, and hence be sort of more efficient. So just a few photos of the Thames barrier. Bob had some photos of it as well. It's called it's a sort of a sector gate. It's a rising sector gate. And it sort of works, and it's tied onto this sort of, it's tied onto a disc at the end, which is essentially pushed down or pulled up again to create the tidal barrier, and it sits in a recess down below, and vessels basically pass over it when it's in the open position. As you can see, the big cruise liner coming through. There's been aircraft carriers and the like. So and there's been discussion about how much wider you could make this, and the discussion says you can probably increase it by another, say, 20 meters or 65 feet of that order. You can actually make these gates, they'll still work in this type of gate, will still work with that wider gate width. But the other key thing to note on the bottom right is you've got to maintain these paint systems, the hydraulic systems, all of that needs constant work to keep this barrier working reliably. So when they press the green button, it closes and it works and it protects. As soon as you have that lack of resilience or reliability, then it's questionable about how you can say that you provide the necessary flood protection to London. But it comes with it as a system. So there are other barriers. You've got the Barking barrier, sort of the Fobbing Horse, Dartford Creek, and you've got the existing Tilbury barrier, which has reached its ends of its design life. It only had a 50-year design life. So currently, Jacob, at the moment, we're designing a reverse mitre gate, which uses the lock gate for the inlet to the port, together with a system which allows it to dual function as a sort of a tidal surge sea gate. So those are the things. So it doesn't stop. This work doesn't stop. Replacement, maintenance, and refurbishment needs to continue throughout, especially when you look over a 100-year design life. And those costs need to be considered. So there are a number of other UK barrier systems. They all range in about the 98-foot, 100-foot range. There's Hull, there's Ipswich, which have both Hull been constructed in the 1980s, Cole in the 1990s. Ipswich was completed 2 years ago. And your Boston barrier, there it is ready to rock and roll, okay, and protect not all of Boston, but a substantial part of Boston. There's still another 2 years to go for the rest of the system around the corner. And then you've got Bridgewater barrier, which is just starting its detail design, and as is Lowestoft barrier. So all these gates, they may be small, but they've also taken a long time to get there, with a lot of political will and a lot of sort of putting the benefits across. Lowestoft barrier, the whole predication of that and why it's needed is all about economic growth. Okay. And the surety for business within that area. There's not a huge amount of residential property, but there's a lot of commercial and business and economic growth related to this, and giving it confidence to stay and also to come. So then I'm going to move on to the Netherlands, the storm surge barrier systems within the Netherlands, which I think many of you know about, which is the Delta Works. And that was shortening the coastline. So that's been picked up by Bob and Bill as a means. And there were 6 major storm surge barriers or sea gates that were constructed over the time, starting in 1958 and finishing with the Ramspol. The Ramspol is a bit of a one because it sits right at the sort of off the map here, as it were, but it basically sits off and away, and it's sort of more related to the larger northern area and the lake that's been formed there. So I'm going to talk about the Eastern Scheldt barrier system, which comes across and covers about 5.6 miles and basically closes off a large proportion. If you go back to this is the Eastern Scheldt barrier here, that where it says Oosterschelde Dam, and it basically closes off that whole area within the estuary, within that tidal coastal zone of Holland. And it's a series of gates. It's essentially, there's 65 piers with 62 gates. They're all about 137 feet, 140 feet wide. And it's been operational since 1984. And the cost at that time was about 2.5 billion euros is the estimated cost for this. But you've got to remember that of that 5.6 miles, it's used islands, it's used ground features, existing features, such that of the system, there's about 1.8 miles of sea gates that can be opened and closed. And it's interesting to note how they're using this to open and close, and more in terms of the opening of things, to actually allow the flow and the tidal exchange to happen within that area, compared to the north of Holland, where they've just closed it off. If I go back quickly, further upstream from the Maasland clearing and above, there's the Afsluit dike, as it were, and only now are the Dutch deciding to change it and put gate systems in to actually integrate it and get the tidal exchange going again. So the environmental impact with the East Scheldt was significantly less. There was still a bit, but nearly as much where it was totally isolated and cut off. And what you'll find with the barriers, and there's a big topic of conversation with Galveston, is allowing that tidal exchange. Normally with flow velocities and getting the water exchange as it normally does, from an environmental impact point of view, it's very strange, but you start to reduce more than about 20% of what the cross-sectional area is of the existing channels, and then you will start to pick up problems. So you'll be introducing sufficient gates to provide you with that tidal exchange, those flow velocities which are not too high and affect fish and all those repercussions. But again, the East Scheldt barrier has been built and has been sort of operates on a sort of almost 2 to 3 times a year in anger. The Haringvliet sluices, which are further up, in a way similar in that it is a sort of a sluices type structure as the Eastern Scheldt barrier. It's not an opening for navigation, but again, its length is, it has 2 rows of 17 sets of gates, each gate about 200 feet wide, and its sort of closure for high tides is again on that similar sort of vein as the Eastern Scheldt barrier.
Hey, Charles, you have about 3 minutes left.
Okay, oh, sorry. Okay, so the Maasland barrier system, you've seen it all. Again, about $545 million, and it spans a 360 meter wide channel. It opens up and the traffic comes through, the navigation traffic, so little navigation impact. And it's only so far has it closed once in anger, but with sea level rise, it's expected to come and raise further. The Hartel barrier sits with it, and again, it comes as a system protecting the Europort and Rotterdam area. And it also comes with the Holland and IJssel barrier as well. So there are 3 sets of barriers in and around Rotterdam, essentially protecting that port area and Rotterdam itself. The Ramspol barrier is further inland, so it's sort of slightly different. This is an inflatable barrier. It cost about 100 million euros. And again, it's operating on a regular basis now throughout the season. So it's about once on average a year that it closes in anger. The St. Petersburg system has a lot of sort of similarities and sort of thinking through for the outer harbor barrier for New York, and that's where some of that concept came when it was sort of discussed at early doors. So a series of sluices and gates and navigation gates at a cost of about 2.2 billion pounds, so about 5 point something, or sort of in that region of 3, I think it's $3 billion, and it was designed for a 1,000 year flood. Water quality was an issue, but the water quality was so bad, what they've actually done is there's a whole big cleanup in terms of all the discharges and the treatment processes, which have actually significantly improved the water quality behind it. How that would work nowadays, I'm not so sure. And these are the series of gates that you've got. You've got vertical, essentially a vertical lift gate as your secondary gate, which is about 360 feet wide, and that's for local normal navigation, and the bridge can rise, but it has a road on top right through the way round. And this is the primary gate, which is very much like the Maestland, and that's about 656 feet wide. It's operated. It was in operation by 2011, and the first flood. First flood it had was in 2011. So it worked straight away. You know, billions spent, but worked straight away and did its job. The Moses system is one of the other sort of key systems which is being commissioned as we speak, although it was used in October this year in its first time of angle preventing flooding to Venice. There's 3 sets of inlets with a whole series of essentially gates that are inflated to rise up and create the differential and prevent the surge coming in from the Adriatic Sea. And then essentially it's filled with water and it comes back down into its recess. That's it deployed in anger. And the interesting thing though was it took such a long time to get there, and there was a lot of issues with funding and everything else. It wasn't ready for last year in November, when it was the second highest flood event in Venice and caused huge, you know, millions and millions of flood damage to Venice. It wasn't ready in time. And these are just photos of this being deployed across the various openings. But again, you've got to have maintenance for these things. You have tunnels with services under, and you've got to think of the locality. And this is Chioggia, which has its own little gates. It's a system. And as part of the Venice system, there's also strengthening in between these entrances of the shoreline of the coastal defenses across there. There's one in Germany as well. Again, it's sort of on the border with Holland and Germany on the Ems River, tidal. It's dual function. It actually retains water to ease navigation on its upstream side, so it almost works like a barrage. And that sort of cost about 220 million euros and has been operational since 2002 with no problems. And these are some photos of it in its location. And then finally, we have the Dutch. And the Dutch have, again, have been looking along their whole coastal side of things and are looking at the Newport barrier. And they've sort of, in a way, come up with a mini Thames barrier, which is a single gate. And that's just started construction as we speak. And that's sort of an image of what it is, but it ties in with the whole dune restoration and coastal defenses actually on the seafront, raising sort of boardwalks and areas. But that's the cofferdam, and it's in its terms of starting. So those are my slides, very rapid go through. There's a lot of barriers to sort of cover, but I think the message is the technology is certainly there, but it has to work as a system. Gates don't work on their own, and there's a sort of long-term thought about investing in their maintenance and ensuring their reliability over time. And sometimes you need to think of where does the replacement barrier go and what does that look like? So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jackson. I think it's very important to think about the 3 speakers that we've had to date. As Charles just said, we're talking about a system. We're not talking about a regional Seagate system and a local system, a municipally based system that work independently. They work together, and they work together to shorten the coastline and to provide total protection to an entire region. As Charles has also discussed, there's some thought, and we hear this a lot, that green solutions are the answer here. And, you know, very few people in the Boston area are as green as I am. I'm like Kermit the Frog, you know. But I recognize that green solutions have their limitations. And as Bob indicated, you can have green solutions in some areas for sea level rise, and you can have some solutions in areas like Louisiana for sea level rise and storm surge, where you have 15 or 20 miles of wetlands to absorb storm surge. But these just aren't applicable for storm surge in the Boston Harbor area. They just don't work. And so we have to consider this gray infrastructure system integrated between communities and integrated between a regional system and all of those communities. So at that, I'll look forward to introducing to you Bill Merrill after the break, and Joe Rossi, who will talk about the Galveston system respectively, and the insurance benefit that we could achieve here from a regional integrated layered defense system. Thank you very much, Jackson. It's my pleasure to welcome the next speaker. The speaker has two distinctions that are self-evident if you know Bill Merrill. One is that Bill has more titles than a member of the British royal family. The second is I've always wanted to meet somebody that has named a multi-billion-dollar project. And it was Bill Merrill that came up with the moniker for the Galveston-Houston Seagate system as the Ike Dike, named after Hurricane Ike. He came up with it and it's stuck and it's been there ever since. And as to his titles, Bill is the former president of the Texas A&M Galveston campus and is currently president emeritus. He is also Regents Professor in the Department of Marine and Coastal Environmental Science, and he's the George P. Mitchell Chair of Marine Sciences at the Texas A&M University Galveston campus. Bill holds a BS in physics and an MA in mathematics from Sam Houston State University and a PhD in oceanography from Texas A&M. He is the George P. Marshall Chair of Marine Sciences at Texas A&M University at Galveston, Regents Professor and President Emeritus. He has been chair of the H. John Heinz III Center for Science, Economics, and the Environment, Vice Chancellor for the Strategic Programs of Texas A&M University System, Vice President for Research Policy at Texas A&M University, Chair of the Ocean Studies Board. He served on the Space Studies Board and on the Board on Sustainability of the National Research Council, and has held presidential appointments with the National Science Foundation. Among his awards are the Distinguished Achievement Medal from the Geosciences and Earth Resources Council, and he is the only person to receive the Distinguished Service Award of the National Science Foundation twice. Perhaps over a strong drink, we can discuss that award. I'd like to hear the background for both of those awards. But following the devastation of Hurricane Ike, Dr. Merrill began the Ike Dike Project to provide hurricane surge protection for the upper Texas coast, including all of Houston and Galveston. So we heard from Charles and from Bob in terms of Europe and the East Coast, and we've heard from Sanjay on the Boston plans. The Houston-Galveston project is one of the most ambitious and challenging projects, and we have the pleasure of having today the person that's been with this project from the very beginning. So thank you very much, Bill. We're proud to have you as part of this program.
Yeah, I apologize for the screen. We had it working earlier and it got contrary on us. My talk, though, well, the number of slides would be less than your introduction, Bill, but I talk so damn slow, being a Southerner. I'd like to talk a little bit about our Texas Storm Surge Protection Scheme. And I think it fits very well into the work you guys are doing, and look forward to working with you on that. We came up, and I'm going to give you a little history in a minute, but essentially working with the Dutch, came up with a scheme actually when I was stuck in my building after Ike. That's why it got the Ike Dike name, which I've been unable to get rid of, by the way. We tried to change it to Coastal Spine about 10 times. And my experts in PR tell me Ike Dike is a sticky name. So once you do a Boston barrier or something, look out. You're going to have a name that you can't get rid of. But the Ike Dike Coastal Spine is extremely simple. It's just based on the Dutch principles of having something of shortening the coast. This is Galveston Bay. Houston is up where about the alignment word is there. This is Galveston Island. Bolivar peninsula over here. Bolivar Roads is where all the water, most of the water comes into Galveston Bay. Some comes in through San Luis Pass here. But Bolivar Roads, you would have to gate, and that's a very tricky problem that I'll get into. But essentially what you do is you shorten the coast. It goes only this length. You don't have to go all the way around Galveston Bay. It was, like I said, I actually thought of this while I was still trapped in high water after Ike. And about a year later, flew over to the Netherlands cold, went to TU Delft, found some scientists there and started talking to them about how it would actually work. I'm a physicist, not a coastal engineer. So they straightened me out quite a bit, and we came up with this concept, which again, these coastal concepts are very simple. And what I found is that it's proven engineering. And so what this does is give us regional protection for the whole Houston-Galveston area. This first proposed by us in 2008 after a bottle of Chateau Margaux, which I was trying to drink to keep it from going bad after Ike. Others, notably Rice University, argued for in-bay solutions, and they looked very hard for in-bay solutions. Essentially what we found together, and now they say you need the Ike Dike plus in-bay solutions, but what we found is that the old, just like the Dutch did in 1953, if you tried to protect every little area with like donut dikes or polders, as the Dutch call them, you end up with these solutions that are fighting each other. Every time you make your polder higher, the other person has to make their polder higher. So you're in this funny situation. The Dutch backed off and said, we're going to shorten the coast and we're going to strengthen the coast. And so, and of course, that's been extremely successful for them since their devastating storm in '53, which also started the English on their very successful coastal barriers. A point that I'm going to keep hitting hard, and I think it's important as you look at your regional solution, is that a strong coastal spine allows for less comprehensive in-bay measurements. That makes some of these in-bay measurements much less intrusive and much easier to actually accomplish. When we first looked at this, we were comparing ours and Rice's solutions, and Rice had 18 20-foot barriers in the bay. And that was very, if you're on one side of it, great. If you're on the other side, you were really going to flood. And so stopping the water at the coast is a very important concept. It makes it less everywhere else. In the Galveston Bay, which is about 7 feet deep, it's still going to have some surges. Boston Harbor, I think you said, was going to be 10 feet deep at the low tide. You're still going to have some surge, but it's going to be much less than that open surge from the coast, much less. And so it actually makes your system much easier to deal with. You have a very strong coastal component, and then a series of additional ways, much like Sanjay showed for Boston. The Army Corps of Engineers finally picked this up after many fights and picking it up, and then running out of money and different types of things like that. But they, with the Corps, with funding from Texas GLO, began a $20 million Texas Coastal Feasibility Study in 2014. After looking at 4 or 5 different concepts, including the in-bay concepts, they adopted a coastal spine concept with some in-bay additions to protect the Houston-Galveston region. We're now doing public comment on that second version of the report. This is what they came up with. At first glance, it looks a lot like the Ike Dike, but it has some differences. The green line is the Gulf line of defense. And as I say, the stronger you make that, the less you have to do in the bay. They have 2 in-bay barriers. You could have many others in the bay. There's a lot of little critical environmental and economic treasures in the bay that can use protection. We already have a dike around Texas City that isn't showing on this. So the idea is stop the water at the coast. You can allow these defenses to be much less intrusive. In particular, the Galveston Bay, the city of Galveston was protected by a ring. This is that blue line down here. Without strong defenses in the bay, that ring would have to be about 18 feet high, which wipes out all your port options and everything else. The port's against it, the city's against it, the park board is against it. So almost ever, when you make these in-bay solutions too intrusive, they just won't work. Now, if you have reasonable, if you lower the water in the bay through this coastal barrier, it only has to be about 4 feet high, and that's a much doable type of thing. That's kind of the heights you get when you have a cruise terminal anyhow, and those sort of things. You really can work with it. So it's a very important concept to keep as much water out of the bay as you possibly can. This is from the Corps report, and it kind of shows what they're talking about. You have the Gulf defenses at the lower part, where you have seawall improvements. Galveston has its famous seawall built after the 1900 storm, which protected us starting in 1915. Of course, water always finds its way in, so it just went in through the back, and we have to start protecting more there. We have a system of gates at Bolivar Roads, which I'll go over. We have Bolivar and West End Galveston Beach dune system. In our analysis of the Corps report, we think this is the weak point in the Corps, in the Gulf defenses, and we're going to argue that this should be made stronger. But then there's also a series of issues in the bay to protect critical infrastructure, the Galveston ring barrier system, a series of non-structural improvements, which essentially is usually raising structures. The Corps calls a non-structural improvement not a structure itself, but a dam or something like that. And then a couple of gate systems and pump systems, which probably aren't extensive enough. Most of our modeling shows that if you put these in, the water will find its way around it. But again, we're working with the Corps on those issues. And again, to sound like a broken record, if you make this area stronger, you can make this weaker and much more tolerable to the people. We also have ecosystem restoration. We're big on that, but we have found that's really not too helpful with surge. What happens in wetlands, for example, is that the foresurge covers the wetlands. We get about 3 feet of water pushed ahead of the actual big surge that comes with the winds. And so that covers the wetlands. And by the time, and in a slow moving hurricane, by the time the surge comes, the wetlands are actually underwater and the surge doesn't fill them. So it just goes on like it's open water. So we have to kind of keep that in mind. I'm all for wetlands, but they do have limited ability, very limited. And we need to keep that in mind. We had hoped we could use more of that, and we're still looking at trying to use a little more of it up higher in the bay. But most of our work seems to show that's just not going to be a cost-effective approach. This is the gate system. This was, I think Bill had mentioned ice storm, and of course, Charles is a major player in the ice storm. The barrier operators, they came over and helped the Corps at our request, and believe me, the ice storm was very helpful. They paid to send many of their own people over. We organized a workshop with the Corps, And they looked at an other system that had about a 27% decline in the tidal prism by the barrier being across Bolivar roads. As I think Charles pointed out, anytime you get below 20, you ought to start worrying. And this system that they have now, which is a system of different types of gates that I'll go over, would only have a 7 to 10% reduction in the tidal prism. It shouldn't change the flows or the property distributions within Galveston Bay. It shouldn't affect its ecosystem function then. And I think if built, this will be the essentially the best barrier in the world for allowing the natural flows. So I'm very pleased with that. What the ice storm people working with the Corps came up with is this is kind of the gate system overview. You see these deep draft navigation gates like the one down in the lower right hand. These are just copies of the smaller copies of the monthly barrier. The reason that they're smaller is they decided on an in and out system there as opposed to a both wave system like the Rotterdam gates have. So you can use smaller gates, and also if one of them fails, you have the other channel to work on. This was actually supported by the Houston pilots who go through there back and forth. So it seems like a reasonable system. You could also substitute barge gates for these floating sector gates. They're actually small enough. So it gives you some flexibility in design. Also, so that's the ship part, the navigation part. And then there's next to that, there's some vertical lift gates. And these are a lot bigger than they first look like. This is about the size of a football field, 100 meters or so long. Allows a lot of flow through. There's a little bit of combo wall in it, which is just like, if you've been to New Orleans, just like the Lake Bourne wall. But then there's shallow water environmental gates, and this is kind of interesting. These were specifically designed to allow larvae flow through. We found that most of the larvae goes through right up in here, this area right up by the Bolivar Peninsula. And so we designed gates where the larvae can get in and out, and as I'm a physicist and not a biologist, I'll call them the sea critters can go in and out without being damaged. And the tests seem to show that these will be much better at that than most gates. So they really did do some thinking on these gates. And this is one of the areas of the Corps report that I support strongly. An area of the Corps report I don't like is the solution that they came up with for the land barriers on West Galveston Island outside of the city and on Bolivar Peninsula, which is mainly natural area, but has a lot of beach houses behind it. This is the kind of before. There's dunes out there now, typically 8 to 10 to 12 feet. They came up with a 14-foot dune and a 12-foot natural dune and adding a lot of sand to the beach, which I'm all for adding that sand. All of our modeling shows that these dunes just won't stand up. And it really doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense just to have 14 and 12-foot protection here when you have 21 foot at the gates and you're going to raise the Galveston seawall to 21 feet. So for consistency arguments and going back to that basic premise, the stronger you make the Gulf defenses or the coastal defense, the easier it is to do in-bay work. We want to make these stronger. Our solution is core enhanced dunes. The old classics are armor core revetments. We're looking at also working with the Corps on some T-walls on like the New Orleans walls. We would cover them with sand. And probably our favorite right now is a clay levee. Clay is very cheap and common in Texas. And we have some designs that would cost less than natural dunes. And it would have about a meter of sand over it and look just like a dune and have the same basic slopes as dunes. And if you walk on it, you can't tell the difference. The Corps hasn't wanted to look at these, but we're pushing them pretty hard. There's existing hybrids all over. Some of them were by accident. This was a rock wall that just got sand covered. They're actually building them in Hawaii and Virginia now. And the dike and dune constructions in the Netherlands are famous. In Nordwijk, essentially, they had an issue with being right up on the water. So they did a very heavy rock protected sand core and then built over it so it looks natural. And I've been there and looked at that. Probably the most innovative and maybe interesting one is the Catwick in New Orleans, where they had a parking problem. So they solved their parking problem by building a dune, putting the parking lot under it. See the happy little car under the dune, and then you walk up and you walk to the stores and beachfront and restaurants, or walk out to the beach, which also has, of course, restaurants, being Dutch. It's a very innovative solution. I found I can't show this to our Galveston City Council because they think they have to be this big to work. They don't. These are huge structures that you don't need. A few feet will work, of course. But it just shows how you can be innovative and combine different combinations in this. Back to the multiple lines of defense on the coast. We're now looking at the Galveston Ring Barrier much more like you guys are looking at Boston, where our arguments with the city leaders, and I think they're being very well received, is that we have to take the core ring of a tall wall isn't really going to work very well, and it'll be almost worthless for nuisance flooding. You're not going to close up a big wall every time you have a nuisance flood, every time you have a sea level rise. And as Bill pointed out, we're going to see those more and more and more. It's just the way that it's going to be. You're going to have more and more times that you're going to be shut down. So we're coming up more like landscape architecture, urban planning approach, where we try to build city functional features that are higher, much like Sanjay was talking about some of the thinking that they're doing in the Boston. And so we're probably going to argue that we don't want that ring barrier. We want a different system. Now that causes problems in that this is the project schedule right out of the Corps report. And they started in 2014. If you remember, we had the idea in 2008. I won't go through all the twists and turns that we had to do to finally get the Corps to actually even look at it. But they're doing the feasibility study now. We have some issues with the feasibility study, but it's got a lot of good things too. It's got to go to the chief for a report in about March, May 2021. And so that's when they would ask for congressional authorization. Notice authorization, not appropriations. That's another fight totally. The Corps already has $100 billion more authorization than it has appropriation. So get in line and start and then you get into the importance. Once we stop porking, project stopped. But the Corps then estimates that it would be, you go into a final design phase. This is just a feasibility study, pre-construction engineering and design that would take 2 to 5 years. And remember, New Orleans was built in 4 years. The whole New Orleans barrier has been in 4 years, and that's because Congress gave them all the money up front and said, do a design build, just go ahead and start building. And according to the normal Corps procedure, we're still in design phase where New Orleans is actually built. Then they talk about building it for 10 to 15 years. I think for New York, they were up to 25 years. That's a long time without protection or inadequate protection. And again, there's no reason that it takes that long except funding. That's the only reason that it hangs out. But then the maintenance and operations, they estimated duration, minimum 50 years. All right, now, so when they do their planning, they've got to plan for a barrier that would be functional at the end of this time period. So we're talking about the turn of the century, about a little bit before. And if you think about that for a second, you're trying to use present technology and build now for something that's going to protect you 80 years from now. It's insane. I mean, but this is how the Corps is constrained to work, both by Congress and its own rules. And so when you're dealing with them, this is what you'll have to deal with. Now, I think for the coastal part of it, much of it being built very strong doesn't bother me. I think when you start looking at putting it inside of a city like Galveston or Boston, it does. I mean, there's no reason to have some of these barriers in there if you're not going to need them for 80 years. And you may not ever need them, or you might have better technology by that time that allows you to build a much different and less intrusive solution. And so this is what we're working on. It's something that you have to deal with. We're hopeful that we can convince Congress that we can do some more some more type of management where we actually take into account what the sea level rise is over the years, how the rainfall rates change over the years, instead of trying to estimate something at the end of the century, which probably isn't all that accurate anyhow. And so you'd have an adaptive management approach as opposed to just fixing everything 80 years from now. Again, my arguments have fallen on pretty deaf ears so far. Again, this is I'll leave you with this slide. This is the final design that they have right now. We're arguing for some modifications, but essentially, and it goes back to my main point in this talk, build that coastal barrier strong, and there's a lot of stuff you can do in the bay that is very feasible. Build that coastal barrier weak, and you're going to have to have great big things in the bay that'll be get in the way of your city functions and the citizens' enjoyment of the water. So I'll leave you with that.
Thank you very much, Bill. As Bill has just gone through in very compelling fashion, this concept of shortening the coast makes sense in the United States as well as in Europe, as Bob pointed out as well, and as I've attempted to articulate. And the technology we're dealing with, as Bill has indicated, is evolving quickly from core centers on dunes to gates that go in and out, smaller gates, to lift gates that allow for reductions in flow of less than 10%, avoiding any kind of environmental impact. Bill has been on the forefront of this, and as you can see, it's a collaborative process between local government, regional government, state government, universities in the US, and firms like Jacobs that have European experience as well. So you're going to take the local firms like Ty and Bond that have done municipal work, and take Jacobs that have done international work as well as local work. You integrate the engineering, you integrate the science, you integrate the planning, and we have a system. The next speaker is a very important speaker. Most of you have heard of the UMass preliminary study on what they call a harbor-wide barrier, what we call a seagate system. And in that, it was very interesting that in this study, in assessing the effectiveness and viability of a regional system, UMass concluded two things that I think have gone underreported. And that is one, The Seagate system was very effective in terms of creating a protection for the entire 175 miles of coastline from storm surge. And the second was that it really had no environmental or commercial impacts. There was no net loss of ecosystem value, and both commercial and recreational vessels, proved not to have a real problem with it, except for the line of entry, which we've addressed with Boston pilots in terms of the placement of the gates. But the issue for the UMass study was what they called economic. Would it be cost effective? And of course, the UMass study did not look at the integration of a regional system with a local system, or what they called a hybrid system, what we call as a layered defense system. This layered defense system has many benefits. The design location will determine the cost. The benefits flow from many different sources. And one of those benefits that we've identified that really hasn't been looked at all for Boston Harbor, except by the Massachusetts Coastal Coalition and Joe Rossi, is the benefit of the impact on mandatory flood insurance premiums. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Joe Rossi, who's Chair and Executive Director of the Massachusetts Coastal Coalition. He founded it in 2012. And the coalition is a regional and national nonprofit which educates, advocates, and informs stakeholders on all flood hazards. Mr. Rossi is also co-chair of the National Flood Association's Legislative Committee, a board member on the Independent Insurance Agent and Brokers Association Flood Insurance Task Force, and a member of the Flood Insurance Producers National Committee. He chairs the town of Marshfield's Massachusetts Community Rating System, which, congratulations, Joe, just received, I believe, the highest possible rating, and is on the Massachusetts Association of Floodplain Management's Board of Directors. Joe graduated from Wentworth Institute of Technology with a bachelor's degree in architecture and began in the field by chairing the town of Marshfield's Seawall Committee in 2010. Joe is also the flood specialist for Rogers Gray. I'll repeat that. He's the flood specialist for Rogers Gray Insurance, one of the nation's largest insurance agencies, where he oversees all flood operations. So Joe will tell us about one of the possible benefits that could be achieved from a layered defense system for Boston Harbor. Joe, we're glad to have you with us.
All right, everyone should see the welcome slide. So thank you, everybody. The one thing that I do that I think is probably pretty evident here is that I'm diversified in the different places that I am involved in, from legislative issues at the national level all the way down to community issues at the local level on flood. And because of that, over the years, I've earned the moniker as Joe Flood. So when you see that, that is the reason that my name is not, while not officially changed, is known as Joe Flood. So I appreciate everybody attending today. And we're going to be talking today about the protecting against the rising waters and the rising rates. Flood insurance and insurance in general is one of the biggest economic impacts when we talk about anything, not just flood. When we talk about the coronavirus pandemic, when we talk about construction of new buildings or starting a business, insurance becomes one of the main topics of focus because of the economics around it. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the economics of insurance when it comes to building any type of levee protected system, which is exactly what the Boston barrier would be. Now, we will talk a little bit today about how when we talk about the elimination of mandatory flood insurance requirement known as mandatory purchase, we're not talking about saying that people shouldn't have flood insurance. As an advocate and as a professional in the field of flood insurance, we're very diligent about making sure we note that flood insurance should always be something that somebody purchases. But what you'll see is that the cost of flood insurance is drastically reduced with a barrier system. So just to give you a little bit of background, I'm not going to go through this. Bill did a great job of giving you my background. I'm involved, like I said, at the national and local level and everywhere in between. My primary role is actually flood specialist at Rogers Gray Insurance. We're one of the largest independent agencies in the country. I oversee all flood operations, whether that be consulting all the way to the placement of flood insurance. So my daily activities involve the sale, placement, and consulting on flood insurance and the corresponding regulations, which touch many different aspects of our industries, right? So flood insurance touches lending to community construction compliance and many other industries in between. So you'll see all of those kind of placed in this presentation to give you a kind of a holistic view of how this affects all those different worlds. But I'm speaking today, a lot of the work that I've done in the perspective of community outreach on this issue has been through the Massachusetts Coastal Coalition, which we were formed, as Bill noted, in 2012 as a local stakeholder group, but then we quickly grew with the Biggert Waters implementation and remapping in 2013. Our board of directors is focused in several different areas, whether it be insurance, legal, lending, real estate. We try to build a board of directors that reflects the different industries that flood insurance touches. And really the key here is we provide services to communities, most notably education events like this, information and outreach. And you can see on our website at noflood.org some of the different things that we do. Membership can be free if you go to noflood.org. Join us and participate in what we do today. So here's a little bit about what we're going to talk about. We need to understand where we've been. We need to know what has happened in the past that will help guide us through the future. We also have to understand where we are now, right? What's the current environment of the National Flood Insurance Program, insurance rating, all the different things that go into understanding the cost of our current environment. And then we have to understand where we're going, right? Where are these rates going? There's a ton of changes coming down the road that will affect the cost and how that impacts the barrier system that could be built in Boston Harbor. So let's talk about a little bit about where we've been. There's really three elements to our coast, and we're going to touch on all three at some point during the presentation today. We're going to talk about our built environment, right? The structures that we're working to protect. We're going to talk about the coastal infrastructure itself, right? Those barriers, walls, those types of structures. And then we're going to talk a little bit about, and it has been talked about, is that actual interaction of both of those systems with our coastline, our beaches and the water that those beaches are touching. So I'm not going to go in depth on the history of the National Flood Insurance Program, except to understand that it is a congressional program that needs to be reauthorized every so many years. And has been alluded several times in today's discussion, it really doesn't take a lot to understand that the congressional environment today is chaotic. And so the National Flood Insurance Program, since its expiration in 2017, has been extended 16 times, short as a week and as long as a year and a half. And we're currently in an extension that brings us to September 30th of 2021. But it's really interesting because the National Flood Insurance Program, while established in 1968, actually was started because in 1929 and 27 to 29, in the terrible Mississippi floods that happened in the Mississippi, flood was actually removed as a covered peril from homeowners policy. So what we saw was this was the beginning of that shift away from, yeah, we'll cover these events, to, you know what, that's going to require a special policy. So from 1930-ish all the way up to 1968, if you wanted to be covered from the peril of flood, it was going to cost you a lot of money, and it was going to be something that was difficult to find. That was the genesis of the National Flood Insurance Program. Rating. So without being an expert in flood insurance rating, these are the basics, right? It's a binary rating system. Buildings are rated in three basic zones. While there are more, there's essentially three. There's the VE zone, or the extremely high risk, the AE, which is the moderate risk, and the X, which is the lower risk. And those three zones are what our current rating system is based on. You're either in or out. You're in one of these high risk zones, AE or VE, or you're not. And that dictates a lot. It dictates your pricing, and it dictates whether you have to have flood insurance. And the messaging around this has been really convoluted, right? If you're in, you have to get it, and if you're out, then you won't flood. And I think that's part of the dynamic we're working to change is, we're all in flood zones. It just depends on the severity. There's no consideration for true risk right now in many of our rates. There's cross subsidization. So right now, taxpayers don't necessarily subsidize the entire national flood insurance program, but there's rates within the program that subsidize other rate classes. Debt and confusion plague the program. It's no surprise the program is $20 billion in debt, although the NFIP has done significant, and we won't go into it today, but the NFIP has done significant things to lessen the burden on taxpayers and policyholders when it comes to NFIP debt. And this past, we talked about 30 named storms, 12 hitting the United States, but the NFIP did not go further into debt. It was all able to be handled through our current rate paying capacity. So that just goes to show the improvements that the National Flood Insurance Program has made to change that dynamic. And that's one of the changes coming down the pike, is to further increase its resiliency. And then private industry is finding ways around the NFIP. If we have time, we may dive into that a little bit, but just know that private industry, because of the federal requirements and laws around flood insurance, has started to get involved in this space. There's 5 million NFIP policies. There's estimated, and the numbers are not calculated in one repository, so it's only an estimate, of about 1 million private flood policies in the United States. So let's talk about the history of mitigation. 130 properties have been mitigated with the federal hazard mitigation assistance programs. Now, that's not a lot, but it's a lot more than if those programs didn't exist. And recently, last year, there was a study that $1 spent on mitigation equals 6 in returns, so it is worth doing. CRS, you heard earlier that I help run not only a CRS users group here in Massachusetts, which is a collective of communities that are in CRS, but I also help the town of Marshfield, my hometown, actually run their CRS program. And Bill alluded earlier, we were just awarded with a National Best Practice Award from FEMA on our implementation of CRS. So there's 1,500 communities that participate in the CRS program with an estimated $500 million in premium savings annually. But CRS shows that if you do certain things, you get those discounts. So they're not just given. You have to prove that you're doing things to improve resiliency in your community. And Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities program is one of the new grant programs that is helping also to mitigate our properties. But there could always, and there needs to be, a focus on doing more in this space. And then a history of losses. Massachusetts has, and that number is actually lower now. I think the number is closer to 60,000 NFIP policies in force, and of course, an unknown number of private flood policies. I can tell you that within our agency, that number alone is somewhere around probably 500. So we know the number is still around 61 to 62,000 in flood policies here in the state of Massachusetts. There were major events here in 38, 54, 78, 91, and of course, 2018. In the history of the NFIP, over $414 million has been paid in claims, and 30% of our structures in the state sit in special flood hazard areas, but only 2% of structures statewide are in special flood hazard areas. And of the 30% of structures in the special flood hazard area, only about 30% of those are insured for flood. So again, we have a major underinsurance issue here in the state of Massachusetts, and that number is nationally. I think the number is 12% of households in Massachusetts, in the country, have flood insurance compared to the estimated 60 million that are vulnerable to flood. So the numbers are just so crazy, and it's only going to get worse unless we do something about it. So where are we currently today? So we took a little bit of a look back in time to see how we got to where we are now. Well, again, back to our rating. There's really 3 primary rate categories. So we know that the prices are dependent on zone, but then they're divided into 3 essential categories once you're within each of those zones. You're either grandfathered, right? So you're grandfathered to a prior zone, and there's several types of grandfathering. It can provide a lower insurance premium, but those are being phased out, and they're being phased out at a slower rate, but those rates are being phased out. Then you have what we call pre-firm, or these are our older structures. So I want you to just take a second and think about Boston. Think about how old our city is. You know, it's estimated that nationally there's 20% of our structures are considered pre-firm or built before the flood insurance program existed. But in Massachusetts and New England in particular, that number could be in some communities as high as 60 to 80%. So when we look at that rate category, they're older structures, significant rate increases. They're becoming severe repetitive losses drastically, and they're becoming severe repetitive losses faster, and it drastically increases these rates. Actuarial rates are newer, what we call post-firm structures, are built after that date of 1975 is what the NFIP actually considers new versus old. Built-in compliance, meaning that it was elevated and rates increase much slower than any other rate category. That's where we want our buildings to be. But I think what's really imperative is taking those first 2 rating categories and looking at the blue box below. The average flood insurance claim since the program started is about $43,000. And FEMA estimates that 90% of those of the repetitive claim properties were built before December 31st, 1974. So what this means is our most vulnerable buildings are older buildings with small to medium-sized losses. And I can tell you that I have seen this time and time again, where our older structures are receiving the most and the worst claims. And you can see that's the rating categories that fall into that. And to show you an example, I'm not expecting you to read these rate tables, but what this shows is as of 2017, and now it's only higher, that these older buildings are seeing huge rate increases. And you can see 25% year after year after year. And as of 2018, that increase was 75% if you added all the years up, and now it's 125%. So this is the category of structures that we're most concerned with, and actually happen to be the category of structures that I would say you'll see the most in our cities and towns in coastal Massachusetts. So, of course, flooding happens. These are some photos of our local communities after our remappings. On the left, the blue line shows a future map height, flood elevation of a future map. The photos on the right show storm destruction. And map changes are impacting costs. You can see on the left and the right, same area through a map change. Huge areas being included in a map change here. So where are we now? Well, like I said, these older structures are seeing these huge 25% a year increases. And if you're not seeing a 25% annual increase, these older structures have a mandatory 5% increase. I mean, look at where we're headed with rates. They're not going to be less. The costs are only increasing. There's legislative changes coming, and there's too many to note here. But basically what's happening is Congress is not going to go any easier on these older non-mitigated structures. The rates are only going to continue to increase. And in the last, since 1953, out of 39,000, over 39,000 declared disasters for flood, and that's per county. So there haven't been that many, but if you add up all the county declared disasters, there has been 54% didn't even include the individual assistance declarations, which are required for individuals to receive aid after a presidentially declared event. So flood insurance in that case becomes your only option for recovery. So this is a really stunning statistic that shows what's happening in our country, that even when we see these presidentially declared disasters, more often than not, they're not being declared with the individual assistance. So where are we headed? Well, we know by studies done in the past that the region has lost already a $400 million accumulated value to sea level rise, right? So, you know, building codes save. So in the past, it's been shown that just since the year 2000, every year we save almost $2 billion in implementing our building code. So this is not just an insurance issue, it's a cost issue around enforcing our building codes as well. And of course, building structures that meet that 100-year standard, which is the levee accreditation and mapping program, which is what any type of Boston barrier would meet or exceed, right? This new program eliminated the with or without levee, meaning that it either met the 100-year standard or it didn't. We now have varying standards in between, but the LAMP program it doesn't instruct the construction of the levee rather than just accredits it. So we would be building to this standard and then get it accredited.
3-minute warning, Joe.
Great, almost done. So we have the example here where this is New Bedford's levee system. You can see all the shaded yellow and black zone is eliminated high-risk flood zone. Well, basically they're saying, hey, there's still a hazard here, but you're not required to carry flood insurance. So that's where flood insurance becomes cheaper. And again, where it can rain, it can flood, but look at the drastic reduction in insurance costs should you go from a high-risk flood zone to a low-risk flood zone in your insurance costs. I mean, the economics, and that's just one building, that can be multiplied across all the structures that we save from paying the high-risk flood zone prices. So you're not getting a reduction in your coverage, you're getting a reduction in your costs. And I think that's really important to make the distinction. And again, premium versus code, right? Large commercial buildings could see a drastic reduction in premiums because the code allows basements it allows basements in high-risk flood zones for large commercial projects. So, I get a lot of questions. Well, how is that building in the seaport getting a basement put in when you're not allowed to have a basement? Well, the code says that you can. That causes the cost of these buildings to go way up because the NFIP, while you're allowed to do it, doesn't reflect does not reflect in the premium. And private flood says we don't want anything with a basement in a high-risk flood zone. So the costs will only improve as well for our areas that are newly constructed, not just our historic structures as well. So you can see that even though this building shown here has a basement and it's mitigated and there's a lot of resilient issues going on here by building up, the fact that it still has a basement, that's the floor it's rated to. And where are we going in the future? Well, I mentioned that there are a lot of changes coming. Risk rating 2.0, I don't have a lot of time to get into that today, but risk rating 2.0 is something the NFIP is working to implement this year. It is, in 2021, I don't think it'll happen for a lot of reasons that we could go into, but the idea is to get rid of this binary system. You're in or you're out and you're stepped in those three primary zones. Let's take a look at the source of flooding. Let's take a look at all the different characteristics that regular insurance programs rate structures by. And while you're looking at this and saying, well, if you're getting rid of the in or out, how would a barrier system help costs? Because it would actually say, okay, the distance of the building to the water source would be much further away. So costs would continue to decrease. And there's a lot of details not really figured out yet, but here are some of the pieces that would go into risk rating 2.0 that are much different than today's rating system. So to conclude, here are some of the impacts, financial impacts, is a reduction of flood elevations. Large commercial buildings would see reductions in premiums. Less flooding would restore some real estate values, reduction of repetitive claims, less impact around remapping. Right, a remapping wouldn't impact the structures because the barrier would help to prevent those maps from changing so often. Restoration and prevention of coastal erosion, less damage to our coastal infrastructure, and less impact with implementation of future rating changes like risk rating 2.0. So again, Joe Flood Rossi, here's my contact information. Go to joefloodrossi.com. You can see all the different things I get involved in and stay up to date with all the different things that we're doing. So thank you, everybody.
So thank you very much, Joe, for that presentation. What Joe has talked about really has a direct tie-in terms of topics touched upon by Charles and Bill Merrill as well. In both their presentations, you saw that there were construction costs involved in the development of a layered defense system, where the regional system actually reduced the cost of the local systems. But you also saw that there were maintenance and operation costs. those maintenance and operation costs could conceivably be covered by the savings in premiums of flood insurance alone. It is possible that the reduction in flood insurance premiums, which could reach more than $1 billion in the 15 cities and towns that flood through Boston Harbor, could actually cover the operation and maintenance costs. So it's those benefits that we need to look at when we actually get serious about flood prevention in these 15 cities and towns, and look at an in-depth cost benefit feasibility analysis that would include such benefits as the ones that Joe Flood just explained. So with that, Joe is our last speaker. So we now go to our question and answer period. Okay, so I have a question now from, let me just see here. I have a question from Nasser Brahim from the Woods Hole Group for Joe Flood and for others. If the harbor barrier's operational plan is to only close some threshold of extreme water level, he says 50 to 100 years, I don't know what he means by that, is expected to be exceeded. Oh, would it be exceeded in 50 to 100 years? Won't the shoreline need to be raised to just below that minimum threshold? And would FEMA need to certify all the shoreline structures to account for risk below the threshold level to eliminate the insurance requirements for large areas? Or shouldn't insurance be held for risks below that level? Accreditation of all the SLR structures will still be needed. How much transaction costs with municipalities really save? Let me just address this as a non-insurance level, just on the concept of the Seagate system. We've seen the Tappan Zee Bridge built in, a new one built in a year. We've seen the Louisiana Great Wall, as Bill Merrill and Charles indicated, built in 4.5 years. We see an antiquated Corps of Engineers process that extends that, can extend that well beyond that. These structures, if they were completed in 2030, would be integrated with shoreline structures to have a design life of the year 2100. So we're not just talking, the 50 years, we're talking about 70, 80, 90 years, and they can be extended because, let's say the design level is such of the Seagate system to keep out storm surge and wave action from entering Boston Harbor. So you have this 175-mile water prism that's 10 feet deep, and you have this Seagate system that keeps more water from coming into that. Well, it can be designed to keep it from ever entering it, or it can be designed over another 10 or 20 years to allow some water to go over without filling up that prism even to the high tide levels. So those are the design specifications that we would meet. And so it's conceivable that we could have a FEMA X zone, or the equivalent by that time of an accredited levee, right through to 2100, saving those premiums. Joe, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'll just answer generically to mention that, in a multi-layered system like what Boston's thinking, or if you include the storm the barrier and then the sea level rise pieces closer to shore, it really all depends. What I wasn't able to get into too much detail on is FEMA accredits the levee through its maintenance and operations, through its design plans. So to Bill's point, however the system is designed to operate will impact the accreditation. And as I mentioned before, FEMA has gotten rid of this yes or no, does it meet the definition or doesn't it? So while FEMA doesn't accredit levees to a more stringent standard, that is possibly something that could be done in the future. And there's discussions about, what if the levee is 5 feet above what's required, how much more of an impact does that make? And that very well could be something taken into consideration under risk rating 2.0. Additionally to that, the area left behind the system, FEMA has to map. So there's inevitably going to be, much like in New Bedford, the river that the barrier protects is a mapped flood area. And I would say 99% of the shoreline around that area was mapped out based on the barrier that was built. Those considerations for the local systems would then maybe not be certified, but they could actually be considered as landforms that would further reduce mapping of areas within the barrier system. So I guess it all depends on how the systems are built, but FEMA would accredit everything based on how it looks and how the system operates, not just the fact that it's there. It's got to be how it operates.
Okay, the next question is from Eric Bender, and essentially the question is to Sanjay. Sanjay, you've mentioned that there are complexities to the approach that's being taken now by Climate Ready Boston. And Eric Bender asks, is there a fallback strategy?
Is there a fallback strategy to the city's current strategy?
Yeah.
I would say in every single plan that we've put out so far, we've identified multiple options for flood alignments. So in some cases, there's a very ambitious preferred option that would maybe run along the coastline. Like in the case of the downtown North End study, we showed two options, right? We showed one option, which is wrapping the wharves, really thinking about running along the current coastline. And then there's always a fallback option of, you know, if the rate of sea level rise increases, if storm intensification increases, if things happen with ice melt that really change the rate of sea level rise overall, we always want to be ready to move forward as quickly as possible. So I would say, please reference the reports and look at the different options we've laid out in each report. Every single neighborhood has near-term and long-term solutions, things that are redundant, and also sometimes we've identified, like in South Boston and in the downtown North End report, fallback options for alignments in the case of an urgent need. And that's all I have on that question.
So Anna McGinty has posed a question for everyone here. How long would it take to build a regional coastal resiliency system, and will it be built in time for it to be effective for the projected sea level rise? Let me take a first stab at that, Anna. First of all, the time it takes to construct this, again, is really up to political will. We did the Louisiana Great Wall, constructed in 4.5 years. Tappan Zee Bridge in a year. It depends on the political will of the federal government and the state government in working with the federal government as well as local governments to achieve that objective. There are fast tracks that have been initiated in a new program with the Corps, which basically says that if you're willing to contribute more than 35%, the standard is like 65% federal, 35% other, that if you are willing to contribute as much as 50%, the Corps will prioritize your project, move it ahead. And as Bill mentioned, there are more projects that are authorized in terms of dollar amount than there are appropriated. I mean, and this would move you up and speed up that process. But let's look at sea level rise. Sea level rise by the middle of this century, let's say we started building a Seagate system, and let's say it took 25 years, which is like the outside, or even a little longer. Let's say it's 2050. By that time, we're going to increase sea level rise only about 1.5 feet, maybe 2 feet, but probably just around 1.5 feet. It's much less expensive and equally effective to have a barrier that's maybe 2 feet high to accommodate wave action above that and some threshold above that. To have a 2 or 3 foot barrier than to build a 12 or 15 foot barrier along the coastline. So that is really all we would need for sea level rise in the middle of the century. Would anyone else like to comment on that?
Bill, I would sort of chip in there is to what you generally find with systems is that it is that step change. So there's a height at which you're trying to achieve defense, looking at an adaptive approach that as you sort of looking further ahead in your adaptive approach, you want to say 2050 or whatever the case may be, and that is setting a defense level, a protection level that you want to achieve for the return period event, so the probability. And when you get to a point where that infrastructure is very expensive, so big cities like Boston and sort of the other city areas which are very don't have flood defenses or very, very little flood defense. That retrospective trying to put something in is hugely expensive, as New York sees it, as it were, now with the HAT study and what they're trying to be battling with. So that point dictates really pushes the sort of the economic decisions of investing the billions in a bigger sort of gate system, with all its billions that come with it at the sort of the outer estuary and sort of shortening the line. And that tends to what drives it. It's either that or it's essentially impact on landscape and how a city values that. And change of that infrastructure and that sort of what the city is and its interface with the water. There's a big part to play with Boston, New York, all these major cities like London and elsewhere. They historically have an interface with the water, and that's all part of their beauty of what they are as a city. So then you'll start to destroy that as you try and protect against the sort of the sea level rise and the storm surge. So there's a point, and you'll see it in a lot of the small barrier systems that we've been designing and doing and appraising, and the bigger ones. You get to a point, and that drives it, and it's normally with sea level rise picking up, and as it starts to accelerate, looking into the future, that's your turning point from an investment decision point. But you've got to work back.
One more question.
Yeah.
Okay, this is to everyone as well. And this is another question from NASA, Brahim, from the Woods Hole Group. Aren't some of the Sandy projects under construction? They are complex and take time for stakeholder engagement, design, and permitting. Haven't most of the tunnels been flood-proofed by the agencies? Again, let me just jump in quickly on that, and then I'll turn it over to Bob Yarrow to comment on. My friend Pat Foy is the executive director of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, the greatest, the largest transportation authority in the world, and has a responsibility for subways and bridges and all kinds of facilities. And he would tell you, first of all, it was the MTA together with the Port Authority for New York and New Jersey that sponsored our first conference in New York City on the option of a regional solution, because they knew the value of this option and the fact that they had very limited options to defend their facilities. The tunnels that the Port Authority has now into New York, they thought they had fixed from the flooding. They thought they had fixed it. Now they realize they're going to have a program to reconstruct some of the major tunnels that is going to take years. And if you talk to Pat Foy, the head of the MTA, he would say, we have thousands of grates all around the city. And we don't even know where they are, let alone how to stop them from being entrances for flooding our system. Bob Yarrow, could you comment on that as well?
Yeah, I think, Bill, I think you provided the answer. I mean, the one thing I would say is that the projects that have been completed, other than the fortified dune and the Rockaways, have largely been deployables, and or I like to think of them as deplorables. And we had a dry run this fall with a threatened storm, and there was a period of time over 3 or 4 days where these deployables were deployed on the lower Manhattan waterfront, and it took forever to get them in place. There was a lot of disruption of traffic and so forth while they were going in, and it's not clear that they were going to be effective. The storm didn't happen, and this is the issue: is that many of these things takes days to put them in place. They're literally thousands of moving parts. The now former transportation commissioner Polly Trottenberg said, "I don't know. We don't have the staff to manage this. I don't know how we would ever, be able to put these systems in place." And it's the challenge of having hundreds or thousands of moving parts on the one hand, and as opposed to the Seagate system that we've talked about, where you've got a single barrier system that's managed as a system managed by a single entity and so forth. I think that's what we're finding is that every one of these onshore barriers is a lot more complicated, a lot more expensive, a lot more time consuming than anybody anticipated at the outset. That's a simple fact of life. Yeah, go ahead.
No, just one last comment on this, and that is the question said, hasn't it already been constructed? The city of New York, which has been at this since 2012, has yet to construct a single linear foot of coastline protection. I'm talking about the city of New York, 550 miles of boroughs. They have just now finished the design and intend to begin the construction of the very first system to address flooding. And that is a 2.4 mile section of the East River. And they are just now, I think it's hung up in court a little bit because of the community's concern about how they were going to destroy a park in order to reconstruct the park and create a barrier to the river. But that is the first construction by the city of New York in 8 years. And there isn't any other construction. No other project is to that point of construction. And many of them don't even have a concept. The financial district of the city of New York, below 12th Street, New York City, produces, I believe, over 20% of the tax revenue of the state of New York. And there is no plan to protect the financial district. None. The only concept that was thrown out, which was dead on arrival, was to fill in 500 feet of the East River, essentially creating a second Hellgate high velocity entrance to the port, and to have private development pay for that. So that's where New York City is right now. There's really a tale of three cities here. One is New York City, whose perimeter approach to sea level rise and storm surge has failed utterly. The city of New Bedford, where their approach has kept them safe for 50 years, and the city of Boston. And thank God we have Sanjay Seth and Climate Ready Boston protecting and working to protect the city.
Hey, Bill, I would just say that, a lot of discussion about the Army Corps of Engineers, and I think the experience in New York and Galveston is that, the Army Corps, it's a very large bureaucracy. It's kind of hard to get them pointed in the right direction. Bill, you might jump in on this, and that it's an iterative process of working with the Army Corps to get them, and I think some of it is providing the political support for the tough decisions that have to be made. Getting the money, overcoming. There will always be local opposition to regional solutions. But that over time the Army Corps is capable of moving these big projects as they did in New Orleans, and the Stamford and Providence and New Bedford barriers all engineered and constructed by the Army Corps of Engineers after years of discussion and so forth. But so we're going to have to work with the Army Corps, I think, unless there's a decision to create a new bureaucracy to deliver these projects, which at the moment doesn't seem to be happening.
So if I could sum up for our presentation today, we talked about four takeaway goals that we wanted to cover in the presentation today. The first is that the existential threat to the city of Boston and the 14 other communities that flood through Boston Harbor is in its nature a regional threat, and it requires a regional solution. Number two, today, there is no regional plan. There is no regional solution. Today, it's every city and town for itself, every residential neighborhood for itself. And really, when it comes down to it, in many cases, every structure, every building for itself, whether it's a commercial building or a residential building. And three, this situation is urgent. Sea level rise is not the issue. That's a nuisance issue that can be addressed for another 30, 40 years with a couple of feet of seawall. The real issue is storm surge, and we need a regional plan to address that. And we need the leadership. It can't be the cities and towns that provide this leadership. It has to be, it's a regional issue. It has to be the Commonwealth of Massachusetts working with those cities and towns to come up with a regional system of a regional Seagate system or that sort of option, together with local perimeter infrastructure such as Sanjay has described. And finally, number four, the option of a Boston Harbor Regional Storm Surge Coastal Resiliency Layered Defense System merits an immediate, in-depth economic cost-benefit analysis. That's how you begin to create a shovel-worthy system so that you can proceed to expedite it and define it and expedite it, as Bill Merrill has talked about with his system. The Army Corps needs to be guided. The reason that that Bill Merrill spoke later than originally anticipated is that he was on the phone with his colleagues in Europe, working on, I believe, a 50-page comment section that's being emanated the Army Corps to inform the Army Corps, direct and guide the Army Corps. We would be well served to have this economic cost-benefit feasibility study in place now, so that we can guide the Army Corps when that multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure bill passes. Dan, I think that finishes it up for us.
I think that's an excellent wrap. Okay, Bill, thank you very much. I want to thank all of our speakers. You did a great job. I think this is an issue, obviously, that's not being put to sleep with this program. I think we'll continue to work with Bill and provide opportunities for further discussion. The city of Boston is doing a lot. The question is how to integrate it with all the other towns around Boston. There is as you can see on the screen right now, there is a feedback survey we'd like you to complete for us before you leave, or I think you can do it later. And again, this program is being recorded, so you're going to be able to go back and look at it again and share it with other people that you work with. And get involved with the EBC if you're not already a member. So again, I want everybody to be safe. These are very challenging times. So we don't want any more spreading of the virus any more than is already going on. So it's almost the weekend, but not right. Yes, Bill, go ahead.
Just one more point. I was very impressed in our breakout sections, and thank you and EBC and Jackson for putting those together. That was really helpful, but it was so short. What I'd like to do is invite people to contact me, especially the engineers that have been working with EBC and EBC to work with us on this, to maybe have in-depth workshops where engineering firms could present their local projects and see how they might be integrated into a regional project over time. That might be a fascinating not this kind of webinar, but a closed kind of workshop to talk about. I don't know if that's possible, but I would invite people to contact me if they're interested in that.
Great, Bill. Anything is possible. I'm serious. We don't necessarily always have a group of 30 or 40. Sometimes we have 200 and 300 and 400 people, but it's very easy to do with Zoom, to have smaller meetings, as many of you I'm sure have experienced. So again, thank you, Bill. Great job. David, I'll give you credit for getting this organized, David Murphy, or at least opening up the door. So everybody have a nice afternoon. I expect you all to go back to work. Go back to your offices, maybe downstairs or upstairs, and we'll be following up this program with additional programs on climate change. So thank you all very much.